2018. Mr. Bolstein is currently a partner in the law firm of Fox Rothschild LLP, where his practice consists of environmental law and governmental affairs. He is listed as one of the top environmental lawyers in Pennsylvania in the Chambers Guide USE, Best Lawyers, and Pennsylvania Super Lawyers. Mr. Bolstein.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm very happy everybody could join us for the PHRC's Fair Housing Program, featuring the author of The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein. As Vanessa mentioned, I've been a lawyer for a long time, 33 years. And during that time, I've worked on a lot of real estate transactions. I'm an environmental lawyer, but mostly I handle the environmental aspects of real estate transactions and corporate transactions. So I've worked with a lot of developers of residential real estate, of non-residential real estate. I've worked with buyers, sellers, lenders. And for many of us who work in the real estate business, we don't spend much time thinking about the history of real estate law and how that history relates to present-day housing discrimination. People in the real estate business tend to focus much more on what's out there now, what ordinances are in place, what the state and local law is regarding what you can build, where you can build, and how you need to build. When I read The Color of Law, and I've got it right here, but when I read The Color of Law, I was really shocked. When I think about housing discrimination, I think about the kinds of complaints that get filed in front of PHRC, where people are complaining to us that they've been discriminated against in housing on the basis of their race, their nationality, their age, their gender, their familial status, their disability or protected class. Lately, we've been getting a lot of complaints from people who say that their landlords aren't honoring their need for a support animal. But the present day complaints really don't tell the whole story, because the whole story is told in this book, In the Color of Law. So I moved to Bucks County in 1989. I thought it was a beautiful place to raise my family, but I was entirely unaware of the discrimination that occurred in places in Bucks County like Levittown against African Americans when that community was formed just after World War II. It's one of our largest developments in Bucks County, in Lower Bucks County. On page 141, Mr. Rothstein recounts the story of Bill Myers, an African American veteran, and his wife Daisy, who bought a home in Levittown in 1957. Bill and Daisy Myers were met by as many as 600 white demonstrators who assembled in front of their house and pelted it with rocks. Crosses were burned. And a family that supported the Myers' ability to live in that neighborhood had their home vandalized. And the local police made no effort to try and arrest the ringleaders. Feeling constantly under threat, the Myers then moved 4 years later back to York, Pennsylvania, where they had lived previously. So when I read that, I thought it's absolutely horrifying how the folks in that community reacted. And what was worse, what I read in The Color of Law was not just the reaction of the neighbors, but how our federal government helped perpetuate this overt housing discrimination through the VA and the FHA. These gigantic housing developments that were built after World War II were all built with FHA and VA imposed conditions that resulted in these communities being virtually all white. And the discriminatory conditions that were imposed by the FHA on the loans it made to the developer, they were imposed not only on the loans that they made to the developers, but also in the mortgages. So that if you bought one of those homes and you went to sell it, you couldn't sell it to an African-American family. So as Mr. Rothstein pointed out in his book, these agencies wouldn't finance a development even if there were just African-American families that lived anywhere nearby. So when I was reading this book, I felt an enormous sense of shame. Shame that our government could not only be complicit in such discrimination, but that it was promoting it and enforcing it for many, many years. Those policies, those governmental policies, led not only to housing discrimination, but as Vanessa mentioned, educational discrimination, since the discriminatory housing policies led to segregation. Schools became segregated because the neighborhoods were segregated, and the government policies encouraged segregation in housing. As Mr. Rothstein noted in his book, segregation perpetuates itself. Neighborhoods that became segregated as a result of these government-imposed housing discriminatory policies turned into segregated schools, and neighborhoods simply created another impediment to the ability of the children growing up in those neighborhoods to succeed. What became clear to me from reading this book was that housing became discriminatory for a lot of reasons, many of which can be traced back directly to those discriminatory laws, regulations, ordinances, and policies that were developed and promoted for many years at all levels of government, federal government, state government, local governments. A lot of that discrimination became embedded. And as Mr. Rothstein noted, remedies that can undo nearly a century of de jure residential segregation are going to be both complex and imprecise. After so much time, we can no longer provide adequate justice to the descendants of those whose constitutional rights were violated. So where does that leave us? What can each of us do to improve the situation to make up for decades and decades of discriminatory practices? As Mr. Rothstein noted, it first starts with each of us acknowledging that the federal, state, and local governments each bear some historical responsibility for creating the situation that we find ourselves in. And second, we must work to put policies in place that undo the harmful and shameful past. We can only do that by starting with the truth, an ugly truth that's revealed in the color of law. So I'm grateful to Mr. Rothstein for having written the book. I feel enlightened by everything that's in there. I think we need to take it all into consideration as we try and move forward and address those discriminatory programs and policies. There's a lot that we can do, and I'm hopeful that this conference can help us come up with a path forward. So thank you, Renessa. Thank you, Chad, and thank you to everybody who's participating in the conference.
Thank you, Chairman. Now we will receive some remarks from PHRC's Executive Director, Mr. Chad Dion Lassiter. Mr. Lassiter.
Thank you so much, Renessa. I just want to say thank you for all of those who are tuning in this afternoon. I think it's also advantageous for us to give a quick framework of how we got here with this monumental book, but also for this August occasion, given the context of the burdensome and troublesome time that we find ourselves in due to not only coronavirus and civil unrest, but the economic collapse. The chairman and I, we reach consensus when we say that we're appreciative of all of the regional offices, and that's comprised of the entire staff of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We've been teleworking since March 16th, and we're still employed against the backdrop of many Americans, whether you were a tattoo parlor, a hair salonist, a barber, an essential worker, or you worked in state government, not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout our democracy. A lot of individuals, and that's an understatement, millions of individuals have lost their jobs. A million individuals have had to engage in unemployment claim registration for the first time. And so we fundamentally at the PHRC, for those who are not members of the PHRC family, but you're supporters of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we're probably the smallest agency in state government that is given the mission to do a lot of work with regards to all forms of unlawful discrimination in the 67 counties throughout this great Commonwealth. And so once again, we thank the staff. We thank you for being resilient. The metrics really speak to how we're doing more work at home than a considerable period of time. Do know that we advocate for you on all levels. We have new complement that's coming. It's not a lot, but every little bit counts. And just continue to do the work. And on the macro level, we'll continue to use agency, intellectual property, and advocacy to make sure that we bring new complement into the efforts that you all are engaged in. But the Color of Law book was a conversation that we had as commissioners and as senior management. We heard about this book. We were excited about this book. This book resonated with the members of senior management as well as the commissioners. And I think that's important because it's not an either or. Under the shared leadership philosophy, it's fundamentally a both and. We moved from a conversation to purchasing the book. We purchased the book. We purchased the book for everyone in senior management and everyone, all of our commissioners. But we just didn't think of ourselves. We thought about each of you. We had a strategic vision. We were intentional in making sure we got to this day. So I'm happy to announce that the first 100 people who have signed on to this Zoom for this Fair Housing Conference 2020, you will receive a free book from the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and the organizing committee of Adrian Garcia, our new Director of Fair Housing, but not new to the fair housing space, and also Renessa and other members of the organizing committee. Don't worry about how we're going to get you the book. Tamika Hatcher is working behind the scenes. She's already archiving the first 100 people who have logged on. You will get this book. Very powerful book. So then we move from that stage to our brilliant Director of Policy, Intergovernmental Affairs, and our former brilliant Chief Counsel, Leslie Morant, and myself having a conversation. And we had a conversation with the chairman. And it was part and parcel of what we've already launched, our PHRC Social Justice Lecture Series. And I wanted it on that side of the house. And Director of Policy, Intergovernmental Affairs, Gerline, she said, well, boss, what about fair housing? I said, no, let's keep it on the social justice lecture side of the house. But we ended up agreeing on this becoming part of the Fair Housing Conference 2020. Unbeknownst to us, we never thought that we would be able to, in the midst of a budget freeze and a hiring freeze, to get a Director of Fair Housing. Adrian Garcia comes to this context with a wealth of experience, and that's an understatement. And so as we move from the embryonic stage of just, everyone having a book, who were members of senior management and commissioners, we gave birth to this moment that we're in today. And I'm delighted, I'm humbled, I'm honored that this is a staff-initiated conference. This is the intellectual property of Adrian Garcia. This is the intellectual property, the wherewithal, and the knowledge-based compassion and passion of Renessa Edwards. I'm just a conduit. I'm here in this space, listening and learning. But let me share with you why I think this book is very impactful in the moment we find ourselves in. When I was a graduate student at University of Penn, I was trained as a cultural anthropologist by none other than Dr. Elijah Anderson. His book, Code of the Street, Decency, Violence, and the Moral Life of the Inner City, is a landmark book. And so we get to Color of Law, but we first build upon Color of Law by looking at the levels of institutional racism in and around the University of Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania is a guest in West Philadelphia, but it has engaged in a lot of those things that you heard the chairman talk about with the GI Bill. The University of Penn was a sleeper commuter college that has boomed to what we see now. But the library was where Miss Maggie lived. The bookstore was where several people lived. You can make an argument for institutional racism, which is prejudice plus power, to bring about a phenomenon called eminent domain. Eminent domain against the backdrop of gentrification interwoven into the whole aspect of redlining is what has created the University of Penn. HOPs on the left-hand side, halls of power. FOPs on the right-hand side, fortresses of privilege, where young students and young people in the community attempt to get on campus, but the fortress of privilege, which are booths comprised of security officers and Penn police saying, why are you on this campus? Are you a Penn student? Locked out by the demarcation of space, or what Charles Mills calls the racial contract. We moved from the code of the street to becoming Penn. Becoming Penn, a very important work that talks about the pragmatic American university and how University of Penn engaged in the raising and the eminent domain and the gentrification and all the things that are in color of law to make it the book that it is, to make it the university that it is, excuse me. And this book is a very powerful book. So as a trained cultural anthropologist, if you can imagine, I was a graduate student, a full-time worker at the W.E.B. Du Bois Collective Research Institute at University of Penn, and fighting the encroachment of University of Penn at the same time, which then brings us to the color of law. So I would recommend that you read The Code of the Street by Dr. Elijah Anderson, Becoming Penn by John Puckett and Mark Fraser Lloyd, and we can't forget the seminal work of Douglas Massey, American Apartheid, that talks about spatial segregation, talks about all of the things, and the color of law brings us from a historical to a contemporary. And we're fortunate that even in the midst of this pandemic, that we were able to remain resilient and still have this Fair Housing Conference with Richard Rothstein. And I'm excited about the things that are going to be presented throughout the course of the day. But I want you to fundamentally know that the Fair Housing Division at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission over the next 2 years, if not sooner, under the leadership of Adrian Garcia and multiple others, is going to be fighting from a theoretical, pragmatic, implementation, institutional, and policy perspective under the law to bring attention to the primary challenges and the secondary challenges that people are facing in the housing space. Each one of you at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission that works on our HUD initiative, not a contract, our HUD initiative, we find you to be valuable, and we are open to any and all suggestions because we want you to be the best on the East Coast as it relates to investigating claims of unlawful discrimination along the indices of housing. Once again, humbled and honored to be here in this space on this particular day. Excited about learning, not just from our keynote speaker, but from Adrian Garcia, Renessa Edwards, and Lau Wood. Once again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Executive Director. Next, I'd like to introduce PHRC's Director of Housing, Mr. Adrian Garcia. Mr. Garcia comes to us with a wide array of experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion in employment and education. He taught financial literacy and retirement planning to local church and civic organizations, and was the Director of Housing, Equality, and Equity with the Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership. Mr. Garcia has been recognized around the country and received awards such as the NAACP Image Award for Business in Roanoke, Virginia, the Frank C. Sumi Award from the Urban League of Lancaster, the LULAC Leadership Award in Memphis, Tennessee, and several others. Mr. Garcia joined the PHRC in June of this year. Director? Unmute. Unmute. There we go.
I should remember to unmute, right? Thank you for being with us and joining us here at the PHRC Fair Housing Conference. Thank you, Renessa, for a great introduction. The pressure is now on. Thank you, Director Lassiter, for increasing the pressure of the Fair Housing Division. We will try and live up to expectation. Once again, welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to try and give you the good news before the reality check that is the color of law. okay? And usually we want to end on a positive. No, I want you to keep this in mind as you begin to get the reality of what the color of law and how that happened, okay? So I'm going to give you kind of the present state of fair housing, where we are today, but I'm also going to taper in some historical factoids. So bear with me as we go through this and as we navigate through this. Obviously, those of us that work in this space, we know that on April 11th, 1968, the Fair Housing Act was signed. And then, and basically it basically prohibited the discrimination in housing, whether it was renting or buying or financing a home, or renting a rental space or dwelling on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. 20 years later, it took 20 years, mind you, 20 years later, they amended the act to include individuals with disability and or handicap and familial status. Now, I still remember, and I'm going to date myself here, but I still remember when I could read in the newspaper and it would say, you know, apartment available, no pets, no kids. No pets, no kids. I mean, kids were no better than pets back then. Okay? Think about that for 1 second. And it was 1988. To put it in context, I got married in 1987. I've been married 34 years this March. So it's one of those things where if you start thinking about it, especially those of us that work in this space and many of you housing advocates that are here today, we know how tired we get at the end of the day, right? We feel that we make certain strides forward and then we get pushed back by something external that we weren't expecting that affects the very work that we're doing, and it affects us in our spirit. And so today I want to kind of focus a little bit on the state of where we are, how we got there, but I also have some good news at the tail end that I think will allow us to move forward without feeling the brunt of everything that's going on. Now, in many cases, it would not take much, right, to enforce a law. First of all, one thing everyone should know, and one of the things that I keep preaching to everyone on our staff is we are the leading civil rights organization in the state of Pennsylvania, period, okay? And it may say Human Relations Commission, but when I do this work, I'm doing it from a position of we can either help to educate or we can enforce this law, whether it be the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act or the Fair Housing Act, okay? At the end of the day, what is important is the complainant, because as Vanessa so eloquently stated, housing is everything. It not only dictates your present, it dictates your future. It dictates your future prospects for education and your present prospects for health, for nutrition. All of this is affected by your housing. So it is going to be, when you put that into your mind and you start hearing our keynote today, and he talks about the color of law, you might wander from redlining and blockbusting into not only is this on a map, but this is in the psyche of generations of people that have come up, okay? Now, based on what I've seen with regards to many of the people that are attending, because I'm checking out and I'm saying shout outs to a lot of the people that I know that are on here. Many of you people know the space of fair housing. But there are two elements to fair housing that we need to recognize, right? You have the fair housing law, and out of those components come the education and the outreach and the enforcement. And then you have what should have been in place and part of the law and not what it's become. It's become a hot potato, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But there's the affirmatively furthering fair housing. This Fair Housing Act is our law. We enforce it when people do not affirmatively further fair housing. And so that's one thing that I want people to take that away, because everyone on this call that cares about this issue has a role to play in affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, we've obviously heard the most recent announcement from the Trump administration, and I'm not going to get political, but it was their administration. And let me give you a little bit of context. I've been following the affirmatively furthering fair housing since the very murmur of the words. In fact, I started following that when I read Secretary Carlson's speech to the Senate committee when he was going to be put into the position. And I saw in his commentary, in his statement, that he was going to look at this through the eyes of a physician, through someone that's been medically trained. And he was going to look at the low-hanging fruit, which is lead in homes, obviously, because he said as much in his statement. And so that led me to believe it's like, okay, well, we're going to be in a little bit of a contest here. But when I saw the affirmatively furthering fair housing, at first glance, they were looking at, okay, they understood that a lot of the municipalities, and I know that many of the municipal officials that are on here with us will relate to this comment. I know that when it came to reporting the matrix for HUD, it was complicated. It was difficult. There are things that are within the control of the municipalities, and then there are many things that are not, especially living in Pennsylvania, where we govern from the bottom up, right? This is a commonwealth, not from the top down. And so you have all these different municipalities. I mean, Lancaster County alone has 61 municipalities, 61 different ways of doing things. And so there are things that a county can control, and there are things they can't control. And so that made it very difficult, and it made it a frustrating job to try and fill those matrix under what was the Obama administration affirmatively furthering fair housing, which I thought had a lot of great insight and a lot of detail, and what a map to be able to do this work. So when the Trump administration first started looking at the affirmatively furthering fair housing, they actually tried to dissect it. They basically looked at it and said, okay, let's get some public comment. Let's find out where the difficulties are, and let's try to address those difficulties. And at first glance, they had come up with a plan whereby they would state, okay, we're gonna be a little bit more relaxed on the reporting, but as an incentive, those municipalities that do better in affirmatively furthering fair housing, not only would they get their CDBG funding and so on, but we would look at giving them additional funding because they're doing good work. And those that are not doing a good job at affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I'll get into the specifics of what that looks like, but those that are not doing a good job of affirmatively furthering fair housing are going to get closer monitoring. That's how it was stated, okay? They didn't change the definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing at all at that time when they were looking at it, and they were just waiting on public comment. However, the announcement that we received a couple of months ago is absolutely basically, it seemed to me, based on everything I had followed, that they basically threw their hands up and said, this is too difficult, this is too hard, I'm not gonna do it. You know, let's just do away with it and give them one simple rule and we're out. And that's exactly what they did. And that's the intent that comes through to me as someone that has been following this. That's what it looks like. It looks like this is too hard. The first attempt that they were making made a lot of sense. They were looking at it, they were going to make it very flexible according to the municipalities. They were going to put an incentive program to it. This most recent decision and the rule that was provided does away with all of that. Okay, so that's where we're at with that. Now, when I talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, why that's important, those are not just your specialty housing choice vouchers. It's not just the Section 8 vouchers. It's not just the mainstream vouchers. It's, you know, it's all of them together, but it's also education and outreach. It's also training in your staff and municipal governments and so on. I am floored by the fact that many of our municipal governments are, and maybe not to their detriment, but you are your job and you focus on your task. And so many times the task that they are dealing with, whether it be zoning ordinances, comes juxtaposed with fair housing. And they always rule on their zoning ordinances. When in fact, all they needed to know was, hey, I need to do a little bit of reasonable accommodation. And what I have found is that once educated, the municipal governments say, wow, you know what? I didn't even realize. I appreciate you bringing it out. So there's a little give and take that I'm willing to provide the benefit of the doubt. I always do that anyway. I figure if I start talking to people about this subject matter and they don't know in earnest, then that's fine. The second time around, then we take the posture of the leading civil rights organization in the state. So there are some complexities to that rule, but let's examine for a moment the two definitions, right? Let's look at the Obama administration definition because I want you to get a real sense for what happened. So the Obama administration says to take meaningful actions that in addition to combating discrimination, that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. Very detailed. Meaningful actions. I want you to hold on to that for 1 second. The meaningful actions is a stark contrast from what we were left with. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. So when you look at Obama's administration, this is what made it, quote unquote, it made it complicated for many of the municipalities. It's not enough to come up with a rule and say to someone, here's what the rule is. There's got to be a roadmap. And what I've learned from that very important definition to the Trump administration definition and the actions they've taken is that really government they're not in the best position to tell you in your community how to affirmatively further fair housing. That's the bottom line. And I'll prove my point in a second. Let me talk to you about the Trump administration's new definition, which is to take any action rationally related to promoting any attribute or attributes of fair housing. That's it. So much shorter, right? Not as detailed. But I'm a Libra. I look at things on both sides of the scale. Glass half empty, glass half full. I always look at the positive side of everything. What I see in this statement for those of us that work in this space, in the enforcement spaces, guess what? You just broaden that for us. That's what you did. You just broaden it for us to look at it and say, well, listen, if you're denying an accommodation for a service animal because your local ordinance says so, not only are you potentially violating the Fair Housing Act, but you're really walking away from the rule for affirmatively furthering fair housing. Okay? And there are other ways that we're going to explore that. But that definition is a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, you can state that any municipality that manages fair housing voucher or subsidized federal housing programs, they basically said, well, that's it. I've got a couple of vouchers and I've already met my burden. So, see you later. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Let's say that you are a county, and I'm not picking on the municipalities, don't get me wrong, but I'm trying to illustrate how this can go wrong very quickly. If you adopt the thought process that by simply having a housing choice voucher program as it exists, you are affirmatively furthering fair housing. No, there's not an affirmation. It's you've already got that program, and yes, you're doing that. But if there are other vouchers, like say, the mainstream voucher program, which is different and separate from what the Section 8 voucher and housing choice voucher is, if your county is if you're able to apply for those and don't apply for those, then wouldn't you now be kind of navigating against taking any action that rationally relates to promoting any attribute or attributes of fair housing? And so when you're looking at these, and you're looking at these just simply as, you know, vouchers, look at it in terms of these vouchers affirmatively further fair housing. And the denial of these vouchers is a walk away from affirmatively furthering fair housing. I know there are a lot of legal scholars out there that will argue this point, and that's fine. I live in the world of fair housing. I'm not an attorney. I should have said that at the beginning, right? I'm not an attorney, but I can read and I can assimilate the information, and I can see the effects of people that are at the hands of people, landlords, property management companies, municipalities that don't affirmatively further fair housing, okay? Now, also part of affirmatively further fair housing is there's the equity end of it. The equity that leads to equality. And I think that maybe as we move forward as a community, we're gonna find ways to ensure equality, right? So here's how some of the people, municipalities, and I bring it up just because of Trump's tweet regarding the suburbs and not having low-income housing in those areas. And what I will say is this: already we're faced with people that are living in substandard housing in rural areas, in suburbs. And these people, as my experience has been able to show me, are the elderly. They are single parent families. They are individuals that have refuged here in the US through refugee resettlement programs. They are individuals re-entering our community from institutions. You know, they are individuals that clearly are within protected classes. And so as a community, we need to look at this and say, what can we do to affirmatively further fair housing? I've gotten to the point where I've started telling people, okay, clearly the federal government is still using this as a hot potato because they're not really sure. So I say, why don't we as a community come together and show them what that looks like? And I believe that in, you know, not to, I'll sing the praises out of Lancaster County, and here's why. There's a model of collaboration that happens in Lancaster County and in other areas that I've also been to, whereby they are already affirmatively furthering fair housing separately. They all have programs that affirmatively further fair housing. Now, under the Obama administration, I probably would have been stretching it a little bit to make that argument. But under the Trump administration's definition, to take any action rationally related to promoting attributes or any attribute of fair housing, then I would say that programs that have to do with landlord mitigation funds, affirmatively furthering fair housing. Why? Because they are providing access and opportunity to a rental unit that an individual, if that wasn't part of it, would not have access to, okay? First-time homebuyer programs. You know, these are individuals that are low to moderate income, many communities of color and families of color that probably would not have access or opportunity were it not for these programs. Eviction prevention network or eviction prevention programs. As important as it is to find housing, attain housing, we have seen through COVID that it's even more important to be able to retain housing. And so when you as a landlord property management company, a municipal government, a community benefit organization come together under the CARES funding to ensure that people are able to stay in their homes, regardless of color, race, religion, or what have you, that is a form of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And it's important for us to get that into our mindset and say, okay, so basically, Adrian, what you're saying is that we need to do more of what we're doing. And there's a case to be made because of the precedent set by COVID. If you weren't doing it before, if you weren't working together before, you're probably working together now. And now you've become, you now have a system. Now your systems are talking to each other and you're providing this wealth of service. So that is really one of the things that I wanted to cover today was the affirmatively furthering fair housing. So if you're able to, and I'll send out some shout outs to PHFA because they've been part of this, working with the homeless, providing funding for the homeless community, providing funding for landlord mitigation funds, providing funding for eviction prevention. And now the municipal governments are now starting to get into the fray as well. So this is how we as a community say to federal government, you know what, I know it's hard for you to wrap your head around every single state and their individual municipalities and how they're going to implement affirmatively furthering fair housing. Here's our plan. Here's how we're going to do it. And it meets the definition set forth by the federal rule. So for all the municipalities out there and for all the community benefit organizations out there that hold this subject matter of fair housing near and dear, that is that's your homework. Is to figure out how we can do it. And obviously, we at the PHRC are having serious discussions with massive organizations about this very subject, about how we measure our affirmatively furthering fair housing. And you're going to start seeing from the state level, I would say maybe a year or so from now, you're going to start seeing some very definitive programs and or actions that are being taken at the state level just because we're taking consideration into this. I said to Director Lassiter, Executive Director Lassiter, when I signed on for this, is like, if I'm not going to invoke change, I do not want to waste time. Anyone can fill this seat. I am nothing special, but I do have a mission and I do want to accomplish that mission. And I know that we have the staff at the PHRC and the commissioners that are going to help us all move forward. One of the things that I also believe that the state needs to do on their end to affirmatively further fair housing, right? Because we're going to define what this looks like. We need to look at our own Landlord-Tenant Act, okay? And though we've had some amendments that have come in and so on and so forth, I'll be candid and I'll get slapped on the hand later for saying this, but the bottom line is this: I have problems with an act that precedes the Civil Rights Act. That's just me, and I have problems with the Landlord-Tenant Act that doesn't recognize that the warranty of the implied warranty of habitability is not good enough because it's not written anywhere inside of a lease. Landlords, 9 out of 10 landlords that I've surveyed don't understand their responsibilities as an independent landlord to provide a place that is habitable. And you ask them what the implied warranty of habitability is, and they don't know. And you ask them what the covenant of quiet enjoyment is, and they don't know. And when you don't know, you violate those. And so I believe that independent landlords are at an extreme disadvantage because they do not have the information that is necessary for them to be able to properly manage their properties and properly manage their business. What other business do you know that you can get into and not follow the laws and not know the laws, right? And so I want to make sure that we, as an agency, participate in any programs that can foster education of landlords. And that's a conversation that I'm also having as we move forward with the housing advocates, Pennsylvania housing advocates, as well as other agencies, because I think that there should be not only a certified independent landlord course, but there also should be continuing education for landlords that include fair housing and the basics of landlord-tenant. That, I believe, goes a long way in basically providing, any action which basically promotes any attribute of fair housing. Because knowing fair housing, first of all, spreading that knowledge is going to be something important. Right now, as an agency, when we educate landlords about fair housing, it's usually after they've already committed an offense. I want to become proactive, and I think it's important for us to get involved in that conversation. So the other aspect of this that I think is at the state level is a universal lease. Right now, anywhere in the state, you could probably come up with at least 15 different variations of a lease. And that is a formula for disaster, right? Because you don't know, and the tenants don't read their lease because every single one of them is different. The language is complicated in many cases. But if you had one universal lease, then no matter where you were living, the language is the same. You are already used to seeing that language, and therefore you have better comprehension, and so does the landlord. Because the landlords, they speak to each other and, hey, what kind of lease do you use? Well, here's the one that I use, and they pass it among each other, and and then everyone adds something different. I think that needs to be standardized. Better comprehension leads to better understanding, leading to better compliance, and hopefully fewer evictions. Okay. So I think that also at the state level, we can encourage all municipalities to enact a standardized rental property maintenance code to ensure that all people live in safe, healthy, affordable, fair housing that complies with all state and federal laws. How we can say that we're affirmatively furthering fair housing and still have people living in rural areas with a hole the size of a bucket bottom in their roof and no one holds anyone accountable, I don't see how we're doing that. Maybe I'm just too much of a logical thinker, but I think there's more room where we can grow in that front. So if we work together on affirmatively further housing, we need to include those items. And I am going to try and stay in the forefront along with Executive Director Lassiter and members of the commission to try and just kind of bang that drum as we move forward. Now, in my previous position with LHOP, we were able to track calls on a monthly basis. And it tracked that elderlies and individuals with disabilities, individuals from outside the US resettled here by refugee organizations, were all people that were basically living in substandard housing. So we need to put this up. And this all happens because different leases, because no code enforcement, because of who they are, because their credit isn't good, because, you know what I mean? There are a lot of mechanisms systematically, it systematically keeps people down. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Now I'm reading somewhere here, as far as I know, landlords are not required to take a fair housing course. No, they're not required to take a fair housing course until they commit a discriminatory act. And so what we want to do is become proactive. And thank you, Susan, for making that comment. We want people to become proactive. Okay, and so being proactive means that we can work together with the state to come together and formulate something that will put landlords at a better state to be able to run their business model. And I can tell you from personal experience in my previous position with LHOP, we used to do this this thing called the landlord snack and chat, an informal discussion. They came in, sat down, had some snacks. We tell them who we were and open it up for landlords to just talk. We created a safe space because, you know, landlords do want to vent about the issues that they're having, and we wanted them to feel comfortable to do that. And so that's one of the things that we did, and it went over very, very well. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the new, it's a new guidance. It's not a rule, but it's a new guidance regarding the service and support animals that HUD put out on January 28th, 2020. And this actually, if you're a landlord or a property management company, take a look at this guidance. It actually gives you a lot of the questions that you had regarding service animals. I know that many landlords think also anything could be a service animal. Well, it used to be, but now if you look at this new guidance, though it is not the rule, and I don't want you to get the two confused, though it is not the rule, this guidance gives you clarity as to what type of animals are acceptable, what type of documentation and from where might be more acceptable. There's new language there that talks about the ability of having, many landlords come across these certificates that people go online for. And it used to be that those were acceptable. However, the new guidance offers that this may not be sufficient because the individual on the other side, the individual giving you that certificate may not have firsthand knowledge of the individual's disability. And so it's important that if you're a landlord, property management company, if you're someone that's looking to get a service animal, that you go ahead and Google that so that you know exactly what this guidance says. It is a guidance, it's not the rule. The rule is still generic, but this guidance helps kind of clear away some of the cobwebs. It is also going to help you better prepare if you're going to ask for an emotional support animal. And it will also help landlords and property management companies be able to ascertain whether or not they're getting a viable request. So that's important for you to know. It's going to help you moving forward. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is something that we've been looking at for the last 18 months, I guess, 18 months, which is the disparate impact language that was being considered. Now this, as of September 7th, I believe, and I'm just going by memory, so forgive me, but on September 7th, they actually finalized the disparate impact rule. I'll give you a little background on that. The disparate impact rule is has to do, in this particular frame of mind, it has to do with the fair lending component. All right, so as you're looking for lenders, they use a lot of underwriting software, desktop underwriting software, and it used to be that people would make the case that underwriting software has a disparate impact against individuals within protected characteristics. And some argue that the people that developed the underwriting software did not represent the people that are being considered under that underwriting software. And I don't want to get wonky on it, but basically what they were looking at is, I think it was the real estate and insurance divisions that were basically petitioning to have this disparate impact rule improved largely in their favor. But they came down on the side of the Supreme Court decision where they talked about the ability to not have, let's see, it was they reflected the 2015 Supreme Court decision, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Community Projects. And basically what they said is, listen, we're not willing to accept at this time that the underwriting is sufficient enough. What we're going to do is we're going to clarify the language on what currently exists. That's basically what they said. We're going to offer you these 5 parameters. Number 1, I think, was you need to be able to show a robust causal link between the decision made and the disparate impact that you're alleging, okay? You need to be able to show that there wasn't another more inclusive method by which to approve or disapprove of this individual's capacity for lending. And then they had 3 others. But the idea is that they did not go wholeheartedly on the side of the insurance and real estate professionals with regard to desktop underwriting. What they did was they said, yeah, we're not going to touch that because there's a lot of evolution that's going on with artificial intelligence and algorithms and so on and so forth. And again, true to form, just like affirmatively for fair housing, it's too complicated. And so they said, we're just going to strengthen. And in my opinion, and I welcome anyone else to read that rule and provide me their input. But as I read it, I think it was better to clarify what was existing than it was to actually acquiesce to what was being asked for by insurance and banking and lending professionals and real estate professionals. This goes a long way in just clarifying the language, kind of like the guidance did for service animals. It clarified a lot of the language that landlords were feeling kind of uneasy about. It's going to do the same thing here. And I think that it's a win-win because they basically stuck to the Supreme Court decision. It's a 2015 Supreme Court decision regarding that. And there was a lot of good stuff in that. So those are the two things that I really wanted to kind of impart. In closing my remarks, I will say this. There is still so much going on that we can't control. COVID has brought to light a lot of our deficiencies in our government, a lot of the disparities that continue to exist in our neighborhoods, in the way we treat families and how we have them live. It has brought forth also, though, I think, a new spirit of collaboration between agencies. And I think we need to build upon that. We have found a way to help many people that are in many different difficult situations in housing. And all we have to do is capitalize on that, is to make it systematic, is to make it an ingrained part of how we provide housing, how we evaluate those that are getting housing, how we evaluate those that are needing mortgages, how we evaluate who we sell homes to. We need to go back to people business. And if there's anything that's going on now is I think we're going back to people business. We're actually, we have to call people now and we have to speak to them on the phone or we have to relate on video. It's not so systematic anymore. And it's press the pause button. This is what it looks like when God presses pause. And so we need to take this moment and pause and say, what can we do better that we learn from this situation so that we can move forward? And so I submit to everyone here, once again, that whatever programs are out there for helping individuals attain housing through a security deposit program, education, first-time home buyer programs, mainstream vouchers is another one. I think we need to embark upon those collaboratively, not just sporadically throughout the state, but everywhere across the state, to be able to get to the next level, to make the reality of what fair housing is supposed to be. Because we're not there yet. We are still, as a society, suffering from growing pains. We're still infants in this world of fair housing. Just the basic rule, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And we're not doing that. And it could be systematic, and some people will throw their hands up and says, well, they're systematic and it's institutional, and I agree with that, but I agree that systems are made up of people. And we must change people's minds. We have to educate people in order to change those systems and in order to change those institutions. Because when we just refer to them as institutions, then we close off as if it's some kind of external force. No, it's us doing it to each other. And you're going to see that clearly when when our speaker, Sir Rothstein comes up, he's going to discuss how that came to be. So as he discusses that and the reality of that hits you, I want you to think about this. Yes, that is our history, and it's important to know what our history is. But now we're in a new history, and we need to improve upon that. And I've given you some tidbits that you already knew. You're already doing this, but you're doing it in silos, right? PHFA is doing it over here, and self-determination housing is doing it over here, and LHOP is doing it here, collaborative with these guys and the YMCAs of the world. But now let's all get together. Let's all get together and do it together and find out what's the best way. And one of the organizations that I really admire, PHFA, they're putting grants out there and they're saying, unless it's a collaborative model, we're not interested in looking at your program. That's a good direction to go, because we need to collaborate to make sure that we go forward on this. All right. So the last thing I'll say is fair housing is not an option, right? It's the law. And I will tell you this, we are looking for equality, but the only way we get there is through equity. And so in case anybody has any doubt of what that is, I will explain it this way. Equity are the mechanisms that we will use to affirmatively further fair housing. In other words, whatever shifts we have to make, whatever housing vouchers we must give to someone, whatever we have to do to ensure that someone that may not have had access and opportunity attains the access and the opportunity. So again, that includes those housing vouchers, that includes the landlord mitigation funds, it includes programs that educate, and it also includes other programs that just give access to individuals that want to buy homes. So think along those terms. And once we have that, then the equality comes in automatically because you've adjusted. It's not giving everyone the same thing at the same time, because it does not reflect on the individual barriers to attaining that. We have to look at the individual barriers and say, okay, well, here's the type of adjustment we need to make in this case versus this case versus this case. And that levels the playing field to allow for people to move forward with their programs. So equality is what we want. Equity is how we get there. And I'm going to entertain some questions because I know I finished a little early. Am I right?
A little bit, Director, but I just wanted to, I guess, piggyback off of some things that you said. First, I'm so grateful that you bring such energy, wealth of knowledge, and passion to the PHRC. When I started here actually 4 years ago, this October, I was thrown right into housing investigations, and it's my first language of PHRC. And, you know, investigating complaints of discrimination in housing, you see so much when it comes to discrimination based on disability, discrimination based on race, discrimination based on familial status. And I don't know about anyone else, but sometimes you can feel powerless against the whole system when you sit back and look at it and you're like, man, what is this? Is me finding PC in this case doing anything? You know, is it just a chip off of the huge iceberg that we see? And so I appreciate having a career where I can chip away, because I do think that's what it takes. But also, like you said, we need to educate the private landlords. We need to maybe redefine the Landlord-Tenant Act, and just the concept that what you just explained, equity is not equality, it's the way to equality. Everyone doesn't need the same thing. We have to look at, excuse me, what people's individual barriers are and accommodate them to provide that level playing field. So I appreciate everything you said. Yes, we can open it up. Does anyone have any questions or any kind of comments?
I will comment back on something that I just saw here. Cumberland County has a monthly landlord meeting. Liz says she can't remember what it's called. Well, that's a great meeting, and I would certainly welcome the opportunity to attend either by Skype or Zoom or what have you, and offer whatever I can to enlighten. I think it's important for us to reach for each other. We're in this together, so we've got to reach for each other. We've got to come together and say that we can define what affirmatively furthering fair housing is, because we're already doing it, and we're doing it with boots on the ground personnel, people that are there and recognize the needs of their community. Having the federal government do it, I mean, they're not going to be able to do it as effectively as we're already doing it. We just need to come together and do it. So thank you for your comment, Liz.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Chris,
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Adrian.
Hey.
So my question is about municipalities. So based on this new rule change from the Trump administration, what are local municipalities doing in terms of analysis of impediments? Like, how are they even measuring the housing gap anymore?
I love that question. Thank you, Tamika, because I did leave that out. One of the things that I wanted to really focus on is, regardless of what this rule says, the one piece that I would not let go of is the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. I would invite every municipality to hold on to that, because that is a tool by which you can formulate a plan. And you can say, okay, we've analyzed all the impediments to fair housing choice, and we have found that we have X amount of disabled individuals. And I'll give you a great example. We may live in a municipality where all the transportation is in one part of the municipalities, and so that obligates this group of people that are individuals with disabilities to live solely in that area, because there are no amenities, transportation, sidewalks, or anything anywhere outside of that area. How's that not segregating? Okay, so in order for you to be able to continue to do this, I think that it is absolutely necessary, important, and valuable to keep that element of analysis of impediments. I would encourage everyone to do that moving forward, because obviously the new rule doesn't give you any direction to go. I would certainly continue to use that. And I'm waiting to hear back, Tamika, from a couple of municipalities where I've actually posed that question. I'm curious to find out what they say.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
I'm Rachel Branch. I showed up on my laptop, owl lady. But, I just attended the Fair Housing Civil Rights Conference in Massachusetts, and that's how Chad Lassiter, how I found out about today. I have a total, I'm from North Adams, Massachusetts, and have a total of 6 years as a Fair Housing Commissioner. One of the things that I saw, and we had never had a complaint that went forward, and I've been worried about gentrification in our city. I think there's a lot of places that are worried about that. But when I'm on the street or meeting people with problems, the biggest thing I saw was fear to come forward. Because if you come forward, then, and I'm sure this has been discussed before, there's the fear of retaliation, the fear of losing your housing, and how do you get, as you say, equity? How do you get fair treatment? How do you get fair housing to work for you? And, you know, I love your furthering. I mean, I learned so much in those 2 days, and from Chad Lassiter and Mr. Garcia, I'm just learning so much from your conference. And I have a community TV show. We've already done one. And of course, I'm taking notes because we're going to talk about this in my next one with John Fisher, who put on the conference in Massachusetts. Thank you. I'm going to unmute. I think, am I supposed to unmute?
Well,
Or mute now? What am I supposed to do?
Yeah, you can mute yourself, I guess. But thank you for your comment. Greatly appreciate it. I thank you for being here. I'm glad that you were able to connect with Chad. Chad is an inspiring leader, and I'm glad to be in his company when we're together discussing these matters. But yeah, the fear is something that people have, and the retaliation is going to be something that is going to happen. And so what I've done in my past is, when people come up, is there's always a statutory time of limitation where someone can actually file a complaint. And one of the things that I used to do in LHOP, and LHOP was a Fair Housing Initiatives program, or is a Fair Housing Initiatives program now under the leadership of Brittany Mellinger. One of the things that I would always do is I would look at what they are complaining about, and then I would ask what the relationship with that landlord is. And based upon their responses, I would say, well, listen, you have 180 days to be able to file this complaint with the state. You have 360 days to be able to file it with the federal government. So let's take care of number one first. And by that, I mean, let's get you stable. If you believe that this relationship is so bad that they're going to retaliate by evicting you, and obviously this process will not be able to stop that eviction, then hold on until you move, and within that 360 days or within that 100, come on back. Let's get you stable first. Get stable first, and once you're stable, if you believe that you have been evicted because of a discriminatory reason, come on back. I'll take that complaint and we're going to move it forward. So that's one way that I try to dissuade that fear, because it's real. Remember what I said at the outset, you know, fair housing is everything. The minute a person, a family that has kids, the minute somebody threatens their housing, they usually call in the next day. And the reason that they're calling in the next day is because they need to think of plan B. If they're by themselves, they may be able to couch surf for a while. But you got kids, you're not couch surfing anywhere. You want to make sure that they're warm, that they're safe, that they're fed, and you don't want to disrupt that. And I understand that as somebody that has investigated both employment and housing cases. And so that's why for me, the housing stability is of the utmost importance. I always give them that option. You don't have to file it today. You can stabilize your housing first, and if that means that you're going to try and move somewhere else, do so, and then come back to me and we can take care of plan B. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Thank you for your comment. Let's see, Kenneth here says, for those who can afford to live in a gated community, are not these forms of de facto segregated, okay. So he's saying, aren't the gated communities de facto segregated communities? I guess, you know, you can look at it in both ways, right? I sometimes question, you know, HOAs and the way they do business. You know, that's just from my perspective. That's, you know, I want you to know that if I make these comments that seem a little outlandish, I don't want you to attribute them to the PHRC or our commissioners. I just want to put that out there. But I am a little out there. I'm a little bit more liberal when it comes to the interpretation. And it seems that you and I, Kenneth, are on the same boat on that. We're looking at these communities saying, aren't they segregated communities? And I guess it depends. It depends if the HOA in that community is basing who can purchase homes on similar characteristics. I once had somebody send me a Facebook market post of a landlord that put out an ad and said, hey, I'm reaching out to you because you're my friends and I'd rather rent to my friends than anyone else. And I don't have a problem with that. But if your friends all share the same characteristics as you do, then we might have a problem with that. See, I'm giving you kind of a tour of what my mind is like, and that's probably not a good thing.
Adrian, I've also had experiences with homeowners associations, especially in my investigations, and oftentimes it's the homeowners associations that's doing discrimination. Like, for example, if there's an owner who's renting out their home, actually this is a case, the complainant requested a reasonable accommodation of a support animal. He deferred to the HOA, and the HOA is the one that denied, didn't engage in the, you know, interactive process and things like that. But I see the HOA sometimes as bullies, and I see them not only with people who are renting in the private communities, but also owners. They can push people out. So I do think that it's modern day segregation right under our noses, And I really wish there was more, not only education for the HOAs, but more of an oversight, checks and balances for them, because they run by their own bylaws and things like that. And it's like whenever we have investigations, they say, well, this is in our bylaws. Right. Well, your bylaws go against the Fair Housing Act. So you got to change that. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to add that.
I also want to send out a shout out to Megan. She says that the DCED completed an analysis of impediments for Pennsylvania. So congrats on that. That is the one component that I think everyone should hold on to. And also, I wish you could get on video, Carl. I love your comment, Carl Summerson, who's a colleague. Love his comment about what about the injunction route to stop a purported eviction because of retaliatory eviction. So Carl, if you can get on, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I've not had a lot of experience with doing injunctive relief. I'll be completely honest. I've opted for stabilizing the home, or I have opted for informal housing resolutions on the front end. So that's kind of like a mediation, but not enforced. So those are the two avenues that I've chosen in the past. And I've had some great successes on those, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with people that don't understand fair housing. They don't know the laws that govern their chosen area of business. And that's what makes this tough. And so that's why I like to opt for the glass being half empty and half full. I don't want to say that everybody out there is doing damage, even though I know that a lot of people are. There are people out there that strictly, I got a call the other day of someone that says, I don't want these people in my neighborhood, and I would appreciate it if the real estate people in the area don't sell to them. Please let me review all the people that are gonna, so there's a lot still going out there. But we're doing it to each other, and I think if we become educated, we could probably improve this pretty quickly on ourselves. Any other questions or comments out there?
Yes, I have a question from the Pittsburgh office.
All right.
And what I've discovered is that housing is such a critical component of our life that our response time is tied into any form of justice. So when I look at an individual filing a housing complaint, and if it takes us 90 or 100 or more days to even address the matter, at that point, we've lost something. That response time is critical. What can we do as this agency to increase our response time to even address, even if it's an insufficient evidence? The fact is, our delay in responding it's almost an impediment. And so this is a great conference. I'm loving it, but I'm a long-term investigator here, and I understand this. Our response time is one of the most critical factors to anyone receiving any type of addressing of their issues. And I think we need to focus training and work our procedures and policies over to make sure our response time will be appropriate. What are your comments?
David, I have a question for you just to get some clarity on what you're asking. When you say our response time, you're talking about PHRC investigative response time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just needed some clarity.
Okay, so what I will tell you is that it's not just at the PHRC level. My experience with the Lancaster County Human Relations Commission, very similar in the response time. The fact is that there's a lot of backlog, and that's something that we deal with. But I will say this, and I see my colleague Morgan Williams is on, and one of the things that I can tell you without divulging too much is we're working on exactly that. we're working on eliminating backlogs. We're working on streamlining the complaint process. I can't say any more than that, but you will start hearing about these things moving forward in regards to response time, at least at the PHRC level, okay? So I want you to know that that's something that we're working on because it concerns us as well, all right? And for Carl, I want to say that the commission can and does seek injunctions if someone is going to be irreparably harmed and the information we have appears to support a violation of the law. And we also do some outreach to respondents. So that's how we're addressing that. Thank you, Morgan, for that. And we, you know, as Morgan was saying, we do try to do this quickly. We try and address these things as quickly as possible. One of the things that I know that I've done since I've been here, I think I've personally called a couple of landlords and gotten involved into some of the mediations, which I typically don't do, and it's not my role, but just to kind of get some speedy resolution. But it is, and again, as I said at the beginning, sometimes this appears to be an uphill, thankless, lonely, disappointing, disillusioning endeavor that we're in sometimes. But every now and then, I said this to my kids because they ask me why I like what I do. Every now and then, you get a glimpse of that thing we call justice. And it's as good as pancakes in the morning. And I love pancakes. So that's what keeps me going. Not my love of pancakes, but the fact that every now and then we can attain true justice. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to send out a shout out to our Pittsburgh crew. They've had some enormous settlements as of late. True justice being applied. I also want to shout out to our Gorlene Rule, who works in our mediation, and they're doing amazing work in mediation, and so those mediations are quicker resolutions. So there are things that are happening at the PHRC level that have to do with that longevity of cases, where we're shortening the time span, getting meaningful resolutions, and still working on how we can proceed to minimize and streamline the complaint process and the investigative process. So more to come on that in the future.
Thank you, Director. I want to transition a little bit just to the Pittsburgh office, as you said. But first I want to ask the question, why does housing matter? And that's a question that some of us may have had to ask, and some of us have been blessed enough to have never had to ask. Here to answer that question is Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission's Pittsburgh Regional Director, Mr. Lyle Wood.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much, Vanessa. And good afternoon to everyone. I hope everyone is safe and healthy today. And always, that's kind of an interesting question. I know that when Executive Director Lassiter texted me and said, I want you to talk about why housing matters, I kind of said, sure, not a problem. When I actually started to think about it and try to quantify it, try to actually put it in perspective, it became a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult, kind of a issue or thought to ponder. You heard Director Garcia very eloquently talk about the need for us to maintain and enforce not only affirmative, furthering, and fair housing, but the rights of all individuals to a safe, clean, decent place, to live. I tend to think about it in different terms. I kind of tend to think about it in terms of transitioning or transiting through life, especially after I got a notice for Social Security and Medicare in the mail this morning. I tend to look at these things as transitioning from one point to another. I think I'm getting to the final acts here, but I can remember as a young man, I'm a Pittsburgh native, born and raised here, chose to stay in Pittsburgh, and can remember, this is back in the 60s, so I'm dating myself. I'm the tail end of the baby boomers. And I can remember the street I lived on and grew up in Homewood. Some of the people on the commission have been in Homewood for some of the commission meetings we've had here. And it is now a predominantly African-American community. When I was a little boy growing up in Homewood, on Cora Street in Homewood, it was a transitioning street, transitioning neighborhood. It was predominantly Italian area and street. But when at that time, everyone pulled together and it was a community. If Aunt so-and-so down the street saw me doing something I wasn't supposed to do, my mother got the call and there was consequences to that. So everybody worked together for community. Everybody looked out for one another. If someone had a death in their family, you could bet that the people on that street would be there with food and solace and comfort to that person. Growing up, I saw that change, and it changed for a lot of reasons. If you're familiar with the history of Pittsburgh, there are Homewood, the Hill District, which everybody's usually pretty familiar with, were large African-American enclaves within the city. When they built the Civic Arena, it destroyed a lot of the spirit and a lot of the culture within the Hill District. A lot of things that have been there that made the Hill world famous were gone for the arena and this huge parking lot. What that did was it forced many families to the east. Home was in the eastern part of the city. Those areas that were predominantly white now started to begin to have African-American residents. And it was about the time when the laws were changing with regards to housing and where you could live. So at a certain point, you had families who had income, who lived in those areas, who now, because the laws had changed, could afford to move from one area to another, to the suburban areas. And it's a matter of quality of life. That's one reason why housing matters. The quality of life that you have for yourself and your family, raising your family, your children growing up there. So as more people were displaced, Homewood became more African-American, and the residents who were there moved further east. Out in the Penn Hills area, which is one of the biggest suburbs in the country, and Monroeville area, another large area there, going out to the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh. And it changed. The tax base changed because a lot of people who had moved in from those African-American areas, were not homeowners. They're renters. Did not and could not, over the generations and the periods of time, build the equity into their properties. And so the neighborhoods changed. The schools changed. Housing matters, again, because of what several of the speakers talked about, is the educational opportunities for your children and your families change. If it's redlined and the properties are less insurable, if you're not able to use the equity in that property to move on, to pass on to other generations, then you are disenfranchised. One of the latest set of statistics that I looked at from the Taxpayer Center basically talked about median family income. And with home ownership, that's extraordinarily important. That's one of the main ways wealth is passed down from one generation to the other. And one reason why there's such a huge gap in terms of wealth and assets within the African American community. Median income or median family wealth for white families is around about $171,000. Okay, median income for Latino families is approximately $20,720. For other groups, protected classes, it's around about $64,620. For African American families, that wealth of income and equity is only $17,150. And that's been over the period of generations of disenfranchisement and discrimination and different terms and conditions. I remember my family in particular. As my father, who was in the Navy during the Second World War, a cousin who is they were all deceased now. A cousin who was one of the Montford Point Marines, first Black Marines in the Pacific. I had a cousin who actually delivered mail in the Army on Okinawa. And my father's brothers and uncles who served in Europe. My wife, my best half, as I say, has two uncles. One was a Tuskegee Airman who, when they came back here, could not ride in the front of the train and had to leave and go to the back of the train or go back to the back of the boat as they were coming on the gangplank from Europe. Or other Uncle Jesse, who you would not believe this, landed at Normandy, found himself in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, fighting. And when they came back, the GI Bill that had been passed really wasn't for them. You know, they weren't able to buy the properties or get the loans from the banks to be able to establish and begin that net family income and wealth. It was an abridged, discriminatory, and limited version of what they had fought for and risked their lives for, to come back to an ungrateful nation for their service, and tended to discriminate against them. And Jim Crow was still rampant and rampaging all over the country. So as a young boy, seeing family members who weren't able to afford to buy the house they wanted to, or live in the neighborhood they wanted to, even if they had the income to do so, it sticks in your mind, and you begin to say, you know, why is it the way it is? So it matters. You know, it affects that. Growing up and looking at the schools that I was able to go to, even though I lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly Black, the grade school and the high school I went to were predominantly white. That made a profound difference in terms of the opportunities I had, the exposure to just different things, cultures, people, philosophies. The fact that those schools required you to read, they required you to write. You had to. There was no choice in that. And even in the household I grew up in, I can guarantee you, Gloria Wood was not going to tolerate a child that didn't speak. In those days, we call it the King's English. No ain'ts, us, or and. No, you spoke the way you were supposed to. You did your homework. Street lights came on. You were on that porch, or you had hell to pay. And that's a difference in terms of quality of life. You know, I didn't have to worry about, was there going to be a roof over my head? I didn't have to worry about, am I going to get evicted? I didn't have to worry about whether or not, you know, I wasn't going to be in a proper environment that a lot of our children face today in a lot of neighborhoods, and largely because of the discriminatory practices that were inculcated by and codified by the federal government. Okay, starting back even before with the Wilson administration, going back to Roosevelt. The New Deal was great. Different systems and safety nets for people were great, but that wasn't meant for us. And when I say us, people of color, people who did not have the ability to do anything much more than to try to survive. And that's a different quality of life, amassed wealth from generation to generation. Your home is equity. Your home is collateral. So that once you've paid off the one, hey, I'm going to buy another one. Use that as collateral. Maybe I'll buy a couple more. And before you know it, you have a stream of income that flows through that family so that you can afford to send your child to whatever school they want to go to, so that you can live in whatever neighborhood that doesn't have food deserts, that doesn't have the type of enforcement by the police that they have in other neighborhoods. Again, I was fortunate in that I could, during the weekends, my mother shipped me off to my uncle's house, who lived in the suburbs. And I did that for most of my young life, and was with my cousins on the weekends instead of back in my neighborhood getting into trouble. So it basically gave me an opportunity to see that there's just more than this street here. Okay, there's just more in this community. There's a big world out here. I would have never had that opportunity had family members of mine not been able to take advantage of opportunities they had because of the changing, not only demographics, but the changing laws and the changing enforcement, of those laws. years later as a young man, out working, single young man at that time, and trying to find an apartment. Couldn't understand why sometimes I would get calls back from landlords I was trying to rent apartments from, and sometimes didn't. And sometimes the ones I did get calls back from, it looked like something from the Friday the 13th movie set. Okay, and you didn't have good landlords, and they were taking advantage of people who didn't have the means by which to afford clean, safe, decent housing, or where the local government was not enforcing the ordinances to make sure the landlords were doing the types of things that they needed to do. You heard about the right quiet enjoyment. You heard about the limited warranty of habitability. Those weren't enforced. If you were a single female head of household, even now, if you're a single female head of household, you have a lot of problems, especially if you are an essential person in this COVID environment. You've got to go out working low-paid job, maybe several, and worry about the neighborhood your child is in. Worry about the school system that cannot educate your child to be competitive as they get older because of the redlining and the fact that the tax base from the area that you live in doesn't generate enough dollars to do the things that some of the schools do outside of your area. Okay, quality of life. You have problems with the firmly furthering fair housing that Director Garcia talked about, and how the present administration is trying to take us back to a time that never existed, or it existed, didn't exist for the benefit of most people, and especially not people of color in the 50s. This is not a Leave It to Beaver world anymore. Okay, it's a Cardi B world, and it's a little different in what we have to deal with and how it affects different people here. So it is important that we looked at. It's for our future. It's for the future of our children. It's for the future of every child that I see. A lot of times, as I'm walking around or driving, I look and I see young kids, and it kind of reminds me of, they're probably better behaved than me, but they were but a lot of young kids, and they remind me kind of me growing up. And I look and I wonder, what kind of environment are they going to? What kind of roof do they have? If they have a roof over their heads, they could be sleeping in a car. They could be homeless. They could be doubled up with relatives. So housing matters. Housing dictates a lot of outcomes within our community. It dictates the flow of money generationally that helps to be able to educate our children, to help to give them that kind of quality of life that they need. And it's the law. Okay, and it's the law. I've been fortunate in my life to have been all over the world, lived in a lot of really bizarre places. And the one thing I can say, no matter where it was, there was one kind of constant. The families there wanted the same things we want for our family. They wanted to be able to support their families, feed them, have a roof over their heads, and have their children do the best and be the best they could be and be better than them, okay, and have a better outcome than they did and had. And so it's important. So it doesn't really matter. It's universal. United Nations is looking at housing and housing types of issues as a universal right. And it should be a right, not a privilege, to decent, safe, clean, and reasonable housing. And we don't see that. So we have to keep fighting. And you have to say something. You have to speak up. You can't sit there and allow this same kind of ridiculousness to take place while people are suffering. While children are going without and wanting the proper environment, again, for them to be and do all they can be. And in closing, in the end, which is probably a surprise, executive directors usually had to cut my mic. As Vanessa's laughing, she knows that's true. In the end, it's something that Martin Luther King said that kind of struck me. And it said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. We have to speak up. If you see something's not right, speak up. If you see something injustice, fight it. Good has to be very, very strong and very good to beat evil. And there's a lot of evil walking around here now. And we owe that obligation because we are our brother's keepers. We owe them. And to get to that beloved village or community that Dr. King talked about, we have to do that. We have to enforce the laws with regards to housing. We have to make housing important, and housing has to be an absolute right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Regional Director Wood. You raised so many good points regarding segregation and just your overall experience. I wanted to give anyone an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment.
Hi, Vanessa, it's me. I'm questions.
Nice to meet you.
I'm always the one to ask questions. So, Director Wood, you raised some really salient points regarding segregation, particularly after World War II and people coming back home and wanting to use GI and what that looked like and how that set up generations. Can you just elaborate on that point a little bit more? Because you hit on it and you glossed over, but I think that's really important for our audience to hear and to understand about how generational wealth sets you up for the years to come. So, for example, any training I've done before, I've talked about this. My grandparents came up from the South on the how can I put it? During the Great Migration. So Black people came from the South. So whether you were on the East or you were in the Midwest, you came north for jobs. So people coming from Mississippi would go into Chicago and Detroit and work in the factories. People on the East Coast coming from Florida all the way up through North Carolina, Virginia, were coming into Pennsylvania, New York, etc., to work in the steel mills. So my grandfather came and started working in the steel mill in the mid to late 50s and was able to purchase a home, actually build a brand new home in like one of the first Black suburb in city of Harrisburg, in the Edgemont area of Harrisburg. And it was a Black neighborhood, just Black people. A lot of them were previous war veterans, but most of these folks did not have the benefit of GI, and they had to pay cash or, get some type of loan or something, but they weren't afforded some of these same opportunities. So I would ask for Director Lau, can you hit on how generational wealth is affected by systemic segregation? Because it was a really great point you raised.
Sure. Basically, it's cyclical, and it's cash flow. It's access to assets. Like you, and this is funny. Like you, most of my family ancestry is from Georgia, from Fort Valley, Macon, and Atlanta, and I still have a lot of relatives down in Georgia now. My grandfather came from Fort Valley, Georgia, to Pittsburgh in 1919. Okay, as part of that wave of that mass migration. The first job he had was in the slaughterhouse, and he would actually be the guy that would knock the cows in the head with a sledgehammer as they took it off to the meatpacking place. He said, "I can't do this anymore." And for the next 40 years, he worked in Jones and Laughlin steel mill here in Pittsburgh. It was even at that time where wages were not equal in terms of African Americans and people of color. Receive less income or less wages than white employees. Basically, it was enough for him to be able to buy a home, to be able to educate my mother and my uncle. My uncle was able to, and it's weird. People on my side of the family are all Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, and on my wife's side, they're all Tuskegee, good HBCU folks. But it was enabled him so that my uncle, with what he was able to get from, because he was in the Army during the Second World War, was able to take probably some of the money he was able to get educationally from the GI Bill, and with assistance from my grandfather, was able to graduate from the University of Pittsburgh and graduate from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. So not only did that provide for my uncle to be able to go on to do some of the great things he did, it also set him up to provide for his family, my cousins, who were able to grow up in the suburbs, go to a suburban school, and they also went on to medical and dental school. And if I could probably have pulled more than a C in organic chemistry, maybe I'd be there talking to them instead of doing this now. But you can see how that flows, how that goes from one generation to another, how those individuals are able to use that equity. If I want to go out and say get a home equity loan based on my assets and the equity I have in my properties, and I have that kind of an advantage, I can do that. I can do those kinds of things. I can pay for those kinds of schools and experiences and other little perks that parents try to provide for their children that help them along the way to be successful. so that that money, again, recirculates back in so that when they have their children, exact same thing. They have that foundation. They have that strong basis. It's not a foundation built on sand. It's a foundation that's built on solid rock, and can go ahead and move those family members, those children, further along than they would ordinarily be. I know a lot of kids, smart kids. I went to grade school with. Family situations were not the same. Okay, they had to worry about a roof over their heads. They had to worry about parents who were unemployed. They had to worry about people knocking on their door, taking their TV and their couches, okay, and their furniture, because that income wasn't there. They didn't have those kinds of economic advantages of that capital being within the family, and that family using that money to advance not only the education, but the life and the quality of life and lifestyles of those members in that family. So that's why that's important. That's why every generation, you should hope, you do better. I want my children to do better than me. Just like my parents wanted me to do better than them, and my grandparents wanted all of us to do better than them. They set that up so that we would have that opportunity to be able to rest within our lives and to do something positive. And that's why that net worth, that continual flow of income is so important for not only just the longevity of that your family, but for the community. If you live in a community where people have been able to amass that kind of wealth and flow that money back into that community, that's going to be a successful community. That's going to have a good school system. That's going to be a secure community. There's not going to be any food deserts there. People will be able to afford their children the type of access and the types of areas that they need to be successful. That's why that's so important. And that's one of the biggest just total drawbacks that there was from that type of segregation, from that type of discrimination that took place. It totally destroyed that fabric of community, totally destroyed those opportunities and the type of atmosphere that essentially helps along the way for people to be successful.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you, Director Wood.
And now, please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker for the afternoon, Mr. Richard Rothstein. Mr. Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that conducts research and proposes policies that protect and improve the economic conditions of low and middle income workers. He is a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is also the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods in patterns that violate the Constitution and require remediation. He is also the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found on his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute, and I'll post that website shortly. Mr. Rothstein's area of expertise includes education, race, and ethnicity, and his previous influential books include Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. He welcomes questions and comments at riroth@epi.org. Please welcome Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Hey. Thank you, Vanessa. And thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. Let me begin by saying that in the 20th century, you know this, we had a civil rights movement. It began by challenging segregation of colleges and universities, and then went on using those precedents to challenge legal segregation of elementary and secondary schools, which had succeeded winning in the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. And then that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives. We recently spent some time commemorating the life of one of the leading activists, if not the leading activist of the time, John Lewis, who talked about how that civil rights movement made good trouble to force the country to confront racial segregation. And by the end of the 1960s, that movement of activists pretty much succeeded in convincing much of the country, if not everybody, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful not only to blacks, but to whites as well, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. By the end of the 1960s, we'd succeeded in ending segregation in lunch counters and buses and public accommodations of all kinds, interstate transportation, voting. We passed in 1968 a Fair Housing Act that prohibited future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. We did all that, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that are either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be if we persuaded the country that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy? How could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We live in an apartheid society that we all accept. Of course, we think it's too bad, but we've never made any effort to do anything about it. Well, as Renessa described, I spent a lot of time before writing this book called The Color of Law about segregation, spent a lot of time writing about education policy. And in my work, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, I wrote a lot of articles and books denouncing, criticizing the dominant education policy of the country, which was that the reason we had an achievement gap between black and white children, between low income and middle class children, was because teachers had low expectations of black children. They just didn't try very hard to educate them. And if only we could raise teacher expectations, the achievement gap would disappear. I regarded that as a ludicrous theory, but we enacted it into law, the No Child Left Behind law of 2001. The law said we're going to now start testing children every year and hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores. And if we do that, teachers' expectations will rise and the achievement gap will disappear. You couldn't have had a sillier theory, but it was embraced by both Democrats and Republicans. It was considered a civil rights law. Of course, it didn't accomplish anything that it promised. The achievement gap is still with us. All we've done is shift all the attention of schools away from a well-rounded education to drills in math and reading to get higher test scores. But I tried to explain that while it's true that some teachers are bigoted and have low expectations of black children, and that may contribute some to the achievement gap, but that's not the main reason. The main reason we have an achievement gap between black and white children is because so many black children come to school with social and economic disadvantages that schools can't possibly overcome. And I remember writing one column about asthma. As you probably know, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. And they have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through their neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And I tried to explain in this column I wrote that, if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma. It's not true of all of them, but more likely to be up at night wheezing, come to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to be sleepier and have lower achievement by a little bit, because sleepy children don't learn as well as wide awake children. It's common sense. And then I began to think that it's one thing if a child has asthma. What happens if you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or any one of a number of other social and economic challenges? How can you ever expect a school like that to achieve at the same level as a school where children come to school well rested, in good health, well nourished, in economically secure homes? No matter how many laws you pass, you can't get the same achievement out of those two kinds of schools. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages in a single school. We call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country, more segregated. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy writer, I began to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational issue. I wasn't really thinking yet about housing. That came later. And I began to worry about how educators could weigh in on the dismantling of residential segregation. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. It involved two school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky, both of which had a very, very trivial school desegregation plan to attempt to address the kinds of issues I was just describing. Those plans gave parents the choice of which school in the district they would attend. But if that choice was going to exacerbate the segregation of the school system, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent who wouldn't do that. So if you had a school, all white school, for example, or almost all white school, and there was one place left in that school, and both a black and a white parent applied to send their child to that last place, the black parent would give them some preference. Trivial program. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school and both the black and the white child apply for it? You couldn't imagine a more trivial desegregation program. But the Supreme Court denounced it. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion, said you couldn't do such a thing. He said the reason that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And he said the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated, he gave it a name, de facto, because of, private bigotry of homeowners and landlords unwilling to sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe private actors like banks or real estate agents, not agents of government, creating that segregation. Or maybe it's because people just like to live with each other, the same race. It's their choice. Racial segregation of neighborhoods just happen naturally because people self-congregate. Or maybe he says just because of income differences. African Americans on average, not all, but on average, have lower incomes than whites. And if you have lower incomes, you may not be able to afford to move to a middle-class neighborhood that's mostly white. He said that all of these reasons is why we have residential segregation. He gave a name to it. It's a name we all use. All of us, blacks and whites, liberals and conservatives, northerners and southerners, Republicans and Democrats, we all use it. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact. Government didn't do it. If government had done it, of course, it would be unconstitutional. If the federal government is creating segregation, that's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. Requires a remedy. It's a civil rights violation. If the 14th Amendment was being violated by state and local governments imposing segregation, that's also a civil rights violation, a constitutional violation. That also requires a remedy. But he said if the government wasn't doing it, if this was just private bigotry and private businesses and self-choice and economic differences, if it happened naturally, he said, it can only unhappen naturally. If it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. Well, I read this decision. It was in 2007, having been thinking about the problem of segregated schools. And I read the decision and I remembered something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the school districts involved in this decision. In Louisville, there was a suburb called Shively, all single-family homes, all owned by whites, a white single-family home suburb. There was a homeowner in that suburb, a white homeowner, who had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home and raise his family there, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop them. But then when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having provoked a riot by selling a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, well, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, agents of the state, are enforcing the racial boundaries of Louisville with mob violence, I began to look into it further. And I found that there was a lot that Chief Justice John Roberts didn't know about the history of segregation or wasn't willing to acknowledge. Because it wasn't just Louisville, Kentucky, but there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases, I am not exaggerating, in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Atlanta, in Dallas, in Washington, in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, of police protected, sometimes even police organized and led, mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in a white neighborhood. Every one of these hundreds of cases where the police either protected violence or, as I say, in some cases, instigated and led it, was a civil rights violation. Every one of them, 14th Amendment violation. Every one of them demands that a constitutional democracy remedy them, and we've never remedied a single one. And then I began to look into it a bit further, and I discovered that something I should have known, I think many of us should have known, but we didn't. And that is, I discovered that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, practiced in the mid-20th century, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area anywhere in this country. There were so many of these racially explicit policies that I concluded and wrote a book about it, The Color of Law. I concluded that de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There is no basis in reality whatsoever to this term that we all commonly use. The residential segregation of every metropolitan area in this country was created, sustained, developed by government at all levels, violating the Fifth Amendment in the case of the federal government, violating the 14th Amendment in the case of state and local governments. Our residential boundaries are as unconstitutional as the segregation of elementary and secondary schools or lunch counters or buses or any of the other institutions that we challenged in the 20th century. But in this case, we've done nothing about it. Well, let me spend a few minutes with you this afternoon describing some of the chief policies that we followed in the 20th century to create segregation. Maybe the first one I'll talk about is public housing. Something we all misunderstand, I think. As much as we misunderstand the notion of de facto segregation, we misunderstand public housing. We tend to think, I'm sure many of you do, as I did before I did this research, that public housing is a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, dilapidated buildings, lots of police activity. That's our image of public housing. It's not how public housing began in this country today. The first civilian public housing in this country was created in the New Deal by the Roosevelt administration, by one of the first, excuse me, sorry about that. I apologize. I should have remembered to do that first. The first public housing in this country was created in the Roosevelt administration in the New Deal by the Public Works Administration. It created housing not for poor people, but for working class and middle class families. In the Depression, we had a 25% unemployment rate, but 75% of the workforce was employed, and that's who public housing was for. You had to be able to have a good job, stable income, be able to afford to pay the full cost of the housing and the rent, no subsidies involved. The Public Works Administration that built the first civilian public housing in this country, built it all over the country, segregating it everywhere, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And that may surprise you, but in the early middle 20th century, there were many integrated neighborhoods, much more integration than we have today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to in the 20th century to see the extent of downtown or urban integration that existed, simply because we were a manufacturing economy, making stuff, and none of this internet business. Factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So did the service industries that are serving that manufacturing industry. So if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. They had to walk to work or take short streetcar rides. They weren't living in suburbs at the time. Well, the Public Works Administration built housing, demolished housing in some cases in these integrated neighborhoods, and built housing on a segregated basis, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, more for whites than for blacks, but always separate, always segregated. The very first public housing project in this country was built in Atlanta, Georgia, in an area near downtown Atlanta called the Flats. It was an integrated neighborhood, about half white, half black. Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were displaced to find less adequate housing elsewhere to double, triple up with relatives. In The Color of Law, I describe how the autobiography of the great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. He describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said in high school his best friend was Polish, dated a Jewish girl. It's what you'd expect to find in an integrated high school, in an integrated neighborhood. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation there that otherwise might not have developed, or if it did, would never have developed with such strength. And this was its policy everywhere. In The Color of Law, I like where I can to talk about self-satisfied, smug places. They think they're better than everybody else, better than you are. One of them I write about, maybe you've heard of it, is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a half black, half white integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. The Public Works Administration demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise would not have existed. This was done everywhere. In World War II, the government's policy to create segregation intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries that hadn't existed before the war. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located. And if the government wanted the tanks and the ships and the aircraft carriers and the planes to be produced, it had to find housing for these migrant workers, black and white. And so it did. The government built war housing around the country near war plants, always segregating it for workers who were working in the same war plants, creating segregation in some places for the first time, because there were no African Americans living in many of these places prior to World War II. The West Coast is a good example of this. For those of you who know some history of the migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country, you know that historians divide up into two great migrations. The first migration brought African Americans out of South Carolina and Virginia and other eastern slaveholding states, former slaveholding states, to places like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, and Detroit, and Pittsburgh. But not to the West Coast. It wasn't, and that was during the first Great Migration was during World War I. It was the second Great Migration that brought African Americans for the first time to the west coast of this country. There were very few African Americans living there previously, so there was no pattern of segregation before World War II. But the government built war housing for war workers, black and white, on the West Coast, creating segregation for the first time. In San Francisco, the government built 5 projects. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans. And the African American project became the center of what later became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. And this is the same policy that was followed throughout the country, throughout the West Coast rather, in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles. That's how the West Coast came to be segregated. After World War II, we still had an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no housing been built during the Depression, except for these public projects, during World War II, it was against the law to use construction materials for civilian purposes, unless it was for war workers. There was a big housing backlog. And then millions of returning war veterans, black and white, came home needing housing in the face of this enormous housing shortage. Government had to address it. I guess they didn't have to. We see today that the government doesn't feel it has to address our housing shortage and homelessness crisis, but at that point it felt it should. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after World War II, proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Remember, public housing at that time was not for poor people. These were for returning war veterans, working class families who had jobs in the post-war economy, who could afford to pay the cost of housing and the rent, but no housing was available. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's expansion of public housing. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons. It was always segregated. They were comfortable with that. Wasn't that they didn't like poor people. Poor people, for the most part, weren't admitted into public housing. They wanted to defeat it because they thought public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. The private sector should take care of the needs of returning war veterans. Not that the private sector was taking care of those needs. Like today, the private sector is taking care of the needs of affluent families, but not of much else. Well, they wanted to defeat the program, and so they came up with a device we call a poison pill strategy. Poison pill strategy, where opponents of a bill in Congress come up with an amendment that they think that can pass. But then when the amendment is attached to the bill, a different majority finds the whole bill objectionable because of that amendment, and the entire bill goes down to defeat. So the amendment is referred to as a poison pill. Conservatives in Congress came up with the following proposal, an amendment. They said, from now on, public housing has to be non-discriminatory. No more of this segregation in public housing. Of course, it was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they planned to vote for the amendment that they had proposed. They thought they could get northern liberals to vote with them to get the amendment passed. And then when the full housing expansion bill came up on the floor of the House and Senate as a non-discriminatory program, the entire bill will go down to defeat because the conservatives would then flip and vote against it. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who wanted expanded public housing, but always on a segregated basis. And there would be no further public housing built in this country. Well, liberals in Congress had a difficult choice to make. Were they going to support the anti-discrimination amendment, as they, perhaps some of them wanted to do? Maybe not the Congress people from Philadelphia, but there were some northern liberals who wanted to support non-discrimination. Or are they going to oppose it in order to ensure that there could be more public housing built and address the housing crisis? Well, they took the latter course. The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas. He got up on the floor of Congress and made a speech along the following lines. He said, I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the non-discrimination amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the non-discrimination amendment is passed and you get no housing at all. Well, I'm not so sure we were better off with that bargain that he made. It was an honest bargain. Perhaps he didn't foresee the consequences of the enormous enforcement and reinforcement of segregation that took place as a result of the vast expansion of public housing and giant towers that were always segregated. Perhaps the most famous of these that was built at that time was the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in St. Louis. Maybe some of you remember reading about it or seeing photos of it being dynamited when it became so dysfunctional it could no longer be supported. Well, the Pruitt-Igoe Towers was two separate projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. And this is what went on all over the country under that act. The amendment having been defeated, the federal government used that vote to defeat the amendment as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 13 years after that. Well, very soon after this occurred, after public housing was expanded on a segregated basis and these giant towers were built, a development occurred that was quite surprising to policy experts, to housing experts. And that development was this: all of a sudden, the white projects like Igoe in St. Louis developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. Pretty soon the situation became so extreme and conspicuous, that even the most bigoted housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of the projects were half empty and others had long waiting lists. Soon all projects were opened up to African Americans. As the white projects emptied out, public housing itself became predominantly African American. At about the same time, the industry that I talked about that had to be located in downtown areas near where many of these projects were existing moved out because they no longer needed to depend on deep water ports and railroad terminals. The highways were being built and they could move out to rural areas. The African Americans living in public housing and in other housing, mostly rented in the neighborhood of public housing, no longer had access to good jobs as the jobs disappeared. They became poorer and poorer, and public housing then had to be subsidized. They could no longer afford to pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. Once it came to be subsidized, the federal government stopped investing in it. Local housing authorities stopped investing in it. It deteriorated, wasn't maintained, became a concentration of the most disadvantaged low-income families, urban slums that we came to know as public housing. It's important to remember that that's not how public housing began. That's not how public housing needs to be. We could have mixed income public housing that wasn't only for the poor, but also provided good housing for working and middle-class families. At the time, before the events I just described happened, public housing was the most desirable housing available. Everybody wanted to get into it. It was well constructed, it was clean, it was desirable, and we could do that again. Well, the question that I address in the book, and that perhaps if you haven't read the book you're asking, is why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black ones? These were all returning war veterans. Why did the black ones need public housing and the whites no longer did? Well, that was primarily because of another federal program, equally unconstitutional, equally racially explicit, a program by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration to move the entire white working class population out of urban apartments rather, public housing and private, into single family homes like that suburb of Shively that I described earlier, outside Louisville, Kentucky. And they exist in every community in this country, around Philadelphia, around New York, around Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, everywhere. The federal government created an explicit white noose around every urban area with a program explicitly designed on a racial basis to move whites only, not blacks, but whites only, out of urban areas into single family homes in newly created suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. You have to remember that at the time, we're talking the late 1940s, 1950s, early 1950s, there were no middle working class families living out in suburbs. It was not considered a desirable place to live. It was thought a crazy idea. The only people living in suburbs at that time were affluent people, urban workers, middle-class families were living in urban areas. The developers of these suburbs could never have assembled the capital to build them on their own. The biggest one was one I talk about in the book, Levittown, east of New York City. There's also a Levittown eventually built near Philadelphia, another one in Delaware. But the first one was east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. 17,000 homes. The developer, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital, as I said, to buy the land, to build 17,000 homes in the private market. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the money for such a crazy idea. We weren't, as I said, a suburban country at that time. Nobody thought that that working class families would want to move to these suburban places. The only way that Levitt could assemble the capital to buy the land and build these homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design, the materials that were going to be used, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats in the federal government. This was a racially explicit policy written out in the federal policy manual for appraisers of housing around the country. The manual was designed to give appraisers guidelines about whether to recommend or not recommend applications to developers for suburban projects, for federal bank guarantees. The manual said explicitly you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a proposal of a developer that would sell to African Americans in a white community. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who's going to build a project that would be all for whites, but would be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the policy manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. Infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. Where did this notion of de facto segregation come from? It is, I say, utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. The federal government created a white noose on a racially explicit basis around every metropolitan area of this country. Well, those homes that were built in cities, around cities and suburbs across this country, like Levittown, were very modest. They were for returning war veterans primarily, but generally for working class families, whites only. Levittown homes with 750 square feet, modest homes. They sold at the time for about $8,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Those homes, as you know, then appreciated in value. They no longer sell for $100,000. You can't buy a house in any of these suburbs for $100,000 today. Depending on the part of the country, they either sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some parts of the country, $1 million and more from $100,000. The white families who were subsidized to buy these homes by the federal government on a racially explicit basis gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. Most families in this country, I'm not talking about the super rich, but most families in this country who have any wealth get it from their home equity. That's how we get wealth in this country. The white families use that wealth, that equity that they gained in their appreciating home values, they used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps medical emergencies or maybe temporary unemployment. If you have wealth and you lose a job, you can weather that, dip into your savings and sustain yourself until you find a new one. If you don't have wealth and you lose a job, you're pushed further down the economic scale. They use that wealth to subsidize their retirements, and they use that wealth to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by racially explicit written federal policy from participating in this wealth accumulation, prohibited from doing so. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. You'd think that people with similar incomes would have similar wealth, but the African American household wealth ratio is not 60% of the white household wealth ratio. It's about 5%. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that we have never remedied. We have never accepted the responsibility to remedy it. That has not been anything that we have taken upon ourselves. We have not considered a constitutional violation. Under this myth of de facto segregation, we let it exist around us without any effort to undo it. We may think it's too bad, but we don't like maybe living in an apartheid society, but we don't take any responsibility to do anything about it. Well, the wealth gap is one of the major contributors to ongoing racial inequality in this country today. It makes the economic lives of African Americans much more precarious than those of whites. By maintaining segregation, whereby few African Americans have the kinds of wealth to make down payments in homes and higher opportunity neighborhoods, it maintains the kind of segregation that I talked about initially that causes an achievement gap in schools. The segregation that the wealth gap supports also predicts health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more dangerous neighborhoods, fewer parks, fewer amenities of all kinds. The wealth gap and the segregation that it creates also predicts police abuse on the discriminatory basis of African Americans, and even the mass incarceration of African American men, which has attracted some of our attention in recent years. I'm not suggesting that the police would never discriminate against African American men if it weren't for segregation, but segregation makes it much, much more intense when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or transportation or schools with high achievement. It's inevitable that they're going to get engaged in confrontations with the police that are going to lead to abusive habits on the part of the police, to mass incarceration. The way police behave in our segregated neighborhoods is similar to the way occupying forces behave in colonial countries when they're charged with keeping down a restive native population. It's the same attitude that police take in this country. They would not take it. They would not be able to take it if we were not segregating African Americans, concentrating them in single neighborhoods. Police abuse, as I say, might still exist, but not to that extent. And the segregation that we created, in large part with this wealth gap, is also responsible for something that I consider, and I think perhaps you do as well, very, very dangerous and even frightening. And that is the political polarization that exists in this country today, that is greater than at any time in memory, and maybe at any time in 100 years. And that political polarization is not entirely racial, but we all know it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans or so many whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences, no way to develop that common national identity, which is essential to the preservation of our democracy. So those are some of the ways in which, when Paul Douglas made that speech, it turns out we're not so better off in schools, in health, in criminal justice, and in our politics. We made a devil's bargain by permitting the government to create segregation and sustain it, and we're paying the price of that bargain now. And we're continuing to make the same bargain today. we have a program today that subsidizes the housing of low-income families, disproportionately minority. It's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. That program is administered by the Federal Treasury Department. Tax credits are distributed to states, who then distribute them to developers to build housing for low-income, disproportionately minority families. The Treasury Department regulations place a premium on placing that housing in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Developers love it. They love it because land is cheaper there. They face no community opposition. They have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why they're bringing Black and brown people into their neighborhoods. It's easy to rent apartments. When you place low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, you place a sign in the window and eligible families walk by and see the for rent signs. That's the same bargain that Paul Douglas made. We're building affordable housing where it's easier to build and where we don't have to challenge segregation in order to build it. And we're going to suffer the same consequences in greater intensity and even more dangerously if we continue on this path. There are many, many other policies that federal, state, and local governments followed to enforce segregation. I'll just touch on a couple of others. The Internal Revenue Service has a program that you all know of granting tax exemptions to nonprofit institutions throughout the 20th century. The IRS unconstitutionally granted tax exemptions to churches, to hospitals, to other nonprofit institutions that explicitly segregated the communities in which they were located. In my book, I talk about the University of Chicago, where an esteemed president, Robert Hutchins, well known for his progressive education ideas, maintained an office in the office of the presidency of the University of Chicago with lawyers whose job it was to challenge African Americans who tried to move into homes surrounding the University of Chicago that were covered by restrictive covenants, by those deeds that prevent sale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. The IRS had no business granting an exemption to the University of Chicago when it maintained this policy. It had no business granting tax exemptions to churches whose pastors frequently led mob violence to drive African Americans out of their neighborhoods in a desperate attempt to maintain homogeneous Catholic parishes. Those tax exemptions were also unconstitutional. The federal highway system, which was built beginning in the 1950s, the interstate highway system, gave local city public authorities the right to design the routes of the spurs that ran into cities. Very frequently, those routes were designed by mayors and by county executives to create and reinforce segregation. Perhaps the best example of that I know of in Chicago. Some of you may know Chicago. The Dan Ryan Expressway that runs through the south side of Chicago is a barrier between Black and white neighborhoods. That's how it was created. And that policy manual of the Federal Housing Administration that I mentioned earlier recommended that highways be built as barriers between Black and white neighborhoods. That was the explicit federal policy. At the state level, we have many policies that reinforce segregation. And once you have a pattern of segregation that's well established, as we do in this country today, you don't need explicit policies to maintain it. Race-neutral policies can reinforce and maintain it. One of the biggest policies that maintains racial segregation today are our zoning rules, which in many cases prohibit these appreciated neighborhoods that were originally created when they were affordable to African Americans, and then subsequently adopted zoning rules that reinforce and maintain that segregation by prohibiting the construction of anything but any townhouses or garden apartments or low-level apartment buildings, anything but single-family homes, frequently on large lot sizes. In my judgment, and I don't think I can be challenged on this, a policy that is race neutral on its face, but that's designed to reinforce and maintain an unconstitutionally created situation is itself subject to challenge. Well, let me say that the policies to redress segregation are well known. Policy experts, housing experts, journalists write about them all the time. Report after report comes out talking about what we can do about this. The problem is not what policies we should enact to redress segregation. The policy is the absence of a civil rights movement like we had in the 1960s that's going to make, in the words of John Lewis, good trouble, to make it uncomfortable to maintain the segregated residential patterns we have as a civil rights movement made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation of lunch counters and buses and public accommodations of all kinds. We are now in the midst of a more accurate and passionate discussion, national discussion about the history, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have had before in American history. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations of the summer and spring involved 25 million Americans, many of them whites, an unprecedented share of whites in those demonstrations, indicating the possibility of beginning to redress residential segregation. But we haven't yet developed the kind of civil rights movement that's focused on this issue. So while the conversation that we're having, the national conversation we're having gives us hope, it can't give us confidence that a new civil rights movement can emerge. But when it emerges, as I say, there'll be many policy ideas of things that we can do. Let me give you a few examples. And I generally don't spend a lot of time talking about them because, as I say, the problem is not the dearth of policy ideas. Everybody wants to talk about what we should do about it. The dearth is a civil rights movement that's going to make it imperative to implement these policies. But I'll describe a few of these policies anyway. If we understood the historical development of residential segregation as an unconstitutional act by government, we would then understand that we have an obligation to implement an affirmative action program in housing. It might look something like this. I talked about these white-only suburbs that were created in the mid-20th century. They sold for $100,000, affordable to both blacks and whites, but blacks were prohibited from purchasing them, and now worth $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. How would we remedy that with an affirmative action program in housing? Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in these developments at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and reselling them to qualified African Americans at deeply discounted prices. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And if we recognized the way in which the segregation was unconstitutionally created, we would have to acknowledge that this is a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. We have some examples around the country of jurisdictions that have adopted down payment assistance programs. They have the same purpose. They don't go far enough because the homes that we're talking about in middle-class communities are now unaffordable even on an ongoing basis, not only because of the down payment required. So deep subsidies are required to redress the unconstitutional segregation that was created. I mentioned earlier that we have a program for low-income families, low-income housing tax credit program that administered by the Treasury Department, distributes tax credits to the states for use by private developers, nonprofit developers to build low-income housing. As I said earlier, that program reinforces segregation because without having a conscious policy to create housing for disproportionately minority families in high opportunity communities, the easiest place to do it is to reinforce segregation, but that can be changed. We can easily change the design of the low-income housing tax credit program to create opportunity for low-income families to move to better resourced communities. We could, for example, prohibit in the design of in what are called quality allocation plans of state governments, and which determine how these tax credits are distributed. We could prohibit NIMBY clauses in these qualified allocation plans. By NIMBY, I mean not in my backyard movements, in which local officials have the power to veto proposals for those developments. We could require that those developments be permitted irrespective of the zoning rules of the jurisdictions in which they're placed. Those are obvious remedies to the segregation that we're continuing to impose with these low-income housing tax credit developments. The reason we don't do them is not because we don't know how to do them. The reason is we have no civil rights movement that's demanding that they be done and making it uncomfortable not to do them. We have another program for low-income families. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure, the Section 8 voucher program. That's a subsidy to families to enable them to afford to rent apartments at the average rent in their metropolitan area. That average, the subsidy that's given to families to pay that average rent, is too low to rent apartments in high opportunity communities where rentals are higher, and too high for market rents in low-income segregated neighborhoods. Landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the program by raising rents above what the market requires. We recently have adopted, or at least the Obama administration adopted, a program that adjusted the subsidies in the Section 8 program. So higher subsidies were granted in, for movement for rentals in higher opportunity communities, and lower subsidies in lower income segregated communities. The present administration canceled the program. They were sued and were forced to reinstate it. So it's being done on a very experimental basis. That should be expanded. And the same policy should be applied to the low-income housing tax credit program. The tax credits should be higher to build in high opportunity communities, and lower to build in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods, so that it's no longer to developers' advantage to build those developments in places where land is cheaper. Well, as I say, the policies are well known. Gentrification is something we talk about all the time. How do we prevent gentrification from displacing large numbers of existing residents in low-income segregated neighborhoods into less resource neighborhoods, perhaps farther away from jobs and community? Again, the policies are well known. We should have rigorous rent control. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should have inclusionary zoning programs that require development to include housing that are affordable, not only for low-income families, but for moderate-income families as well in these communities. And we should freeze property taxes for existing homeowners. Many homeowners in low-income neighborhoods have owned their homes for many, many years, bought them when prices were quite low, and now they've paid them off, but are now forced to move because they can't afford the property taxes as the neighborhoods appreciate in value. Their property taxes should be frozen. And that shouldn't result in harm to the budgets of schools or fire departments or libraries, because the lost property taxes can be recouped at point of sale. So if you have a homeowner in a segregated low-income neighborhood who bought his or her home, say, for $50,000 20 years ago, and now sells the home for $500,000, instead of getting a $450,000 profit, that homeowner, when they sell their home, gets only maybe a $350,000 profit, because the lost property taxes are then returned to the Treasury. That would be a reasonable program to prevent massive displacement. We're not doing it not because we know what to do, don't know what to do. We're not doing it because we don't have a civil rights movement that's demanding the implementation of such a policy. Let me conclude by saying that for the last year or so, I've been in conversations with a group of national civil rights leaders, fair housing leaders, to create a new national committee to redress racial segregation, neighborhood segregation. We suspended work on it when the social distancing of the pandemic began, because the focus of this effort was to create and support local committees, local civil rights groups that were going to engage in the program to redress segregation. But we're beginning to figure out how to relaunch it. When we do, we'll send out an announcement. And I don't know, Renessa, if it's you or somebody else who's organizing this event, but if you want to collect names of people who have registered for this event who want to receive notice of the launch of this committee in their communities, you can do that and send me the list, and I'll make sure they get added to the national announcement. If anybody wants to do that, they should provide their name, their email address, and the town in which they live, because the focus of this effort is going to be on local committees. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm delighted that we're going to have some time for discussion and questions that remain. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rothstein.
Wow.
Wow, so much information, and I think it's so important that we get the real story, and not the edited version. But enough about me. I wanted to just remind everyone that you all can receive Mr. Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. Please send your email to Tamika Hatcher in a private email or message. And I just wanted to open up the floor for any questions or comments. You can feel free to unmute yourselves.
Well, this is somewhat of a statement. This is Martin Cunningham. Mr. Rothstein, I so appreciate again your graciousness in giving us an opportunity to hear this very sordid history that our positions of power within our own government was allowed to perpetuate throughout history. And I think it's something sobering, and it's something that it's needed to be refreshed in our mind or acknowledged for the first time with so many people. And I think your work is really, I don't like to use the word and just bandy it about, but it's seminal in that it does elucidate this question of what's been going on very, very clearly with what you put out. And I personally thank you. As much as I want to cry when I read your book, it's important and it's great. It's a great work, and I thank you for being here to talk about it.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry. I was going to say something. This is Joel Bolstein. I'm the chairman of the PHRC. I don't know if you were on the program when I first welcomed everybody, but I was impacted by reading your book. I'm an attorney by trade. I've worked many years in the real estate business. One thing I wonder if you could respond to is, my view of it is most of this is local, meaning, yes, we can focus our attention in Washington. I think people place way too much time and energy on trying to change things in Washington, okay? When these kinds of issues, the issues of segregation in housing, the issues of a history of segregation and what that's resulted in terms of educational segregation, they require a lot of unpacking at the local level, meaning the people who live in those communities get to vote on who their leaders are going to be. Okay, so if you live in the city of Philadelphia, okay, whether or not that city council approves an area to be blighted and then torn down and redeveloped, moving out all the people who live in that community, that's purely local. You don't go to Washington and say, Washington, can we have your approval to do this? And yet those cities are basically run by, I mean, they're folks who have been in government a long time. They have constituencies who they respond to. And I think it's at the local level that people need to speak to those city council members and demand these kinds of changes. But when we go into these communities, Lyle Wood is, I'm looking at him right now, and we had a field hearing out in Pittsburgh where people talked about gentrification. And I would say to them, well, have you gone to city council and objected to what's going on? And they'd say, we're there all the time. They're just not being helpful. They're just not listening to us. So, I mean, part of me says the only way you're going to get this kind of change is if you can get people elected in these local government positions who are willing to listen and are willing to do something about it. I mean, do you have any thought on where this focus should be? Should it be equally on federal and state, or should it be more on local versus federal, or does everybody need to be re-educated about this and work together to try and make a change?
Well, I think it has to start locally. It has to build up to federal, but we have to start locally. As I said, I think we need local civil rights groups. You know, city councils didn't respond initially when the civil rights movement in the 1960s said they should stop segregating water fountains and buses. And in the case of buses, it took a boycott in Montgomery, spurred by Rosa Parks, to get something that civil rights advocates had been demanding for a long time and not getting anywhere. But that's why we need new civil rights groups that are going to be locally based. I'll say it has to start even below the level of government. It has to start with the private sector. I wrote an article in the New York Times about a month ago in which I focused on a community in California called San Mateo, just as an example, but it applies just as much to communities in Pennsylvania. An all-white, segregated, upper middle class community. It didn't start out upper middle class. It started as a working class community, but then, as you know, property values skyrocketed then. And in this article, I can give you the link and you can distribute it to people on the on this webinar. I showed how you can identify the banks, the real estate agents, the developers who worked with the federal government in the 1940s to create this as a segregated all-white community. Well, those banks, real estate agencies, developers all have successors today. They're still, they may not have the same name, but I was able to identify the successor firms that cooperated with the federal government to segregate those communities. Well, those successor firms should be creating funds for private reparations. The present leaders of those firms aren't at fault, but when you assume the obligations of a prior firm, you assume their moral obligations as well as the financial ones. And there's precedent for this, after World War II, when the German government had to deal with the legacy of Nazism. The German government paid reparations, but the private companies that employed slave laborers paid reparations as well, not because the present leaders of those companies are Nazis, but because they inherited a firm that profited from the Holocaust, from the use of slave labor, and they now recognize an obligation that they have a special obligation to do something about it. Well, the same thing is true here. I'm not in any way comparing Nazism with Jim Crow, but I'm saying the concept that private firms that profited from the creation of segregation have an obligation to contribute to its remedy is one that's valid here as well as elsewhere. And that's even below the level of government. But none of this is going to happen without a very active civil rights movement, and that involves more than writing letters to city council or testifying. It requires much more aggressive activity. I don't know the form that a new civil rights movement will take, the tactics it will use. Obviously, it won't be the same as the ones that I grew up with in the 1960s, but that's what's going to be required. We need to raise the temperature of this issue in the general public. And until we do that, we're not going to be successful.
Mr. Rothstein, can you hear me?
I certainly can.
It's a pleasure talking to you. I think I got wind of your book on one episode of Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. She spoke about your book. I did have a question regarding gerrymandering, and I'd like to know.
Regarding what? I'm sorry.
Gerrymandering.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Gerrymandering. How does that coordinate with this government effort back when in the housing industry? How did that coordinate with this?
Well, I don't know. I've never really thought about gerrymandering. We have a. Let me. I don't know the answer to your question. I'm going to answer something related. We have another mistaken notion that the reason that the government imposed this segregation in the 1930s and 1940s was because it depended on the Democratic majority depended on Southern Democrats, and had to compromise with Southern Democrats to impose segregation. That was certainly true in some cases. For example, you couldn't have a Social Security law that operated differently in the North and the South. So you needed to, in order to get Social Security, you had to compromise with Southern politicians to exclude the occupations in which African Americans predominated, like agriculture, for example. But that doesn't apply here. In housing, the Southern Democrats, segregationists, were quite content to let Northern states integrate their schools so long as they could preserve segregated schools in the South. And if the federal government had adopted a policy of conceding to segregation in the South when it came to housing, but built integrated public housing projects in the North, Southern Democrats wouldn't have objected so long as they could segregate projects in the South. So we have to ask, why did the federal government do it? And we have to understand that the federal government, the Democratic Party, the New Deal, was a segregationist party. And it was segregationist in the North. The reason we didn't create integrated developments, the reason we excluded African Americans from the suburbs that I talked about before, was because Northern Democratic congressmen demanded it, this segregation. It had nothing to do with the South. So that's not exactly gerrymandering, but we have to understand that we have a lot to deal with in understanding the history of this country. The New Deal was certainly very progressive in economic policy. Indeed, African Americans switched from the Republican to the Democratic Party in 1936 because for the first time, they got benefits from the federal government. Benefits were on a segregated basis. Separate housing, for example. But under previous administrations, under the Hoover administration, they got no housing. So the history of the New Deal is complex, but we should not somehow blame this on Southern Democrats.
Yes, this is Lyle Wood. One of the things, particularly in lieu of what the Chairman Bolstein said, at least in our area here, part of the problem that you have, and I agree, it's local. One of the obligations that we have as individuals who enforce the act and look to seek social justice is to do as much outreach as we can to be able to train and teach those grassroots community people as much about the law, as much about the options that they have, and not just sitting there and accepting everything. In the area where the chairman was talking about when he came here, you have and I can say this freely, you have a council person who is little too comfortable and close to the developers and developing interests that actually it comes in and not so much gentrifies, but refuses to actually include the community in decisions that are going to affect, again, their quality of life, that affect the decisions that are going to shape their communities. And that the options they have are not just accepting that, but how they can have the law enforced, how we can train them and do our outreach to them to be able to provide them with that information. And if we find that there's any systemic basis or just flat out the disparity in terms of conditions, that they can come to the commission and that we can enforce the law. We can go ahead and investigate, and if there is a violation, to enforce it. The best way to change, in my experience, the best way to change hearts and minds when it comes to those individuals that affect the outcomes of housing is to hit them in the pocket. And to educate them and hopefully train them to obey the law, or that there's a consequence. So we have an obligation to do that. And the more outreach training that we do with those grassroots individuals who are going to be our eyes and ears, they're going to be our canaries in the coal mine of the problems that we have, then I think we slowly begin to change that dynamic.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I've got a comment.
Yes.
My name is Jim Stowe. I'm your partner and neighbor to the south, Montgomery County, Maryland, and also our Atlantic Region Vice President of the International Association of Official Rights, Human Rights Agencies. And I'm so pleased to be a part of this program. And thanks to Chad also for the outreach to those of us in the association. Mr. Rothstein, again, I would just echo an earlier comment by a colleague relative to your having done this work and our appreciation for having done it. I'm reminded often and more times than I care to acknowledge about my miseducation about what has happened in this country on the issues of civil and human rights. And I think myself someone who has at least a bit of knowledge about what goes on and what did happen. But this goes back again to this purposeful and intentional effort to continue to carry on those issues of segregation and certainly discrimination as a rule of the way we live and as a paradigm of how we want to continue to have this country exist that still continues today in 2020. And you just laid out in your book so many very specific examples where, again, when you peel the onion layers back, you find out that we got, in fact, the government at the very root of all this. So the question is this. I'm supposing, and maybe there's a fault in the question I'm asking in that regard, but decision makers, at least from the federal level, were engaged in these processes. And I'm asking, how then was this pervasive and intentional method to continue to segregate and deny rights guaranteed, as you said, in a number of areas in the Constitution? How is this allowed to happen in an ongoing kind of way throughout the history of time? And I should say too, in some regards, even continuing today. And maybe there's an obvious answer here, I realize that, but I still want to kind of hear your thoughts about that, because I keep going back to this idea that you've got the Fifth Amendment, you've got the 13th Amendment, you get the 14th Amendment, you get the 15th. I mean, all of these are in place to guarantee and undergird our ability to have access to all that any citizen has in this country. And yet, officially, both policy and direction, it would appear that those are put aside to maintain that white America has its premier place in all that we do and say, in terms of not only ownership, in terms of also wealth, in terms of influence, in terms of decision making, and an entire look at how we exist in this country today. How does this continue to happen even yet today?
Well, you know, we don't enforce our Constitution today, do we? We have lots of examples today of violations of human rights in this country, in this day and age. So why should it be surprising that we violated civil and human rights and constitutional rights in the 20th century? They did no better than we're doing in many respects. So the answer is simply politics. We don't enforce rights. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself, never has. The only time the constitutional rights are enforced is when there's an active movement of concerned citizens, aggressive, sometimes going beyond the law in civil disobedience, that demands the enforcement of rights. And if that movement doesn't exist, the rights don't exist. I think that's the only way I can describe it. I do want to make one comment, though, about something that your question struck in me, and I just want to, it's not directly a question you asked, but you know, when these returning war veterans came home and demanded housing, and the federal government created a giant housing program for returning white war veterans, that wasn't a privilege, that was a right that they got. And we should be careful about the way in which we talk about white privilege. There's certainly a lot of white privilege around, but there's also a lot of white rights. That the problem is African Americans didn't have those rights, not that whites did have them. Every American should have the right to decent housing. And the fact that some Americans got it and other Americans didn't, the problem is that some didn't, not that some did. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. This is not really a white versus black issue. This is an unconstitutional denial of rights to African Americans, and that's where the remedy needs to lie. That's my view.
I certainly appreciate that again, Mr. Rothstein, but I guess I go back to the point of that, who was in the seat at the time the decisions were being made is what I'm getting at. We were not there.
Right, as I said.
I'm African American, so my whole point, I guess I'm trying to make is that if we go beyond that point in time, and of course you don't cover that necessarily in the book, but going even before that time, there has been always this notion that what I believe as a black man does not have any bearing on my ability to pursue what it is to be a man in an equal society. Those opportunities have had impediments. I've had all kind of barriers, you know, throughout history of this country. And I guess my point I was trying to make a little earlier on is that in the event that when these various entities, some were according to your book, some were actually a good intention, but when it came up to ask for things like insuring of the loans, as an example, it was the federal government insisting then that it must include these mandates that no black folks be involved in the process. Obviously, you know it better than I. But my point I'm making is that somebody made that, again, edict, and that was followed. And I don't believe that most of those persons look like me as an African American. That's all I'm trying to suggest.
Sure, that's absolutely right. I agree with you.
Mr. Rothstein, this is Adrian Garcia. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I thank you so much for being here and providing this wealth of knowledge. I see an opportunity for recommending your book to, you know, kind of dovetail what Lyle was saying earlier and what some of the other commenters have said, of having a local focus on this effort and having the uncomfortable conversation. And I think using your book as a centerpiece in those conversations when we're looking at what we're doing now in affirmatively furthering fair housing, if you don't know the history, you can't rectify it, you can't correct it. And I believe your book is certainly something I'm going to strongly recommend to all municipal governments as they look at their process of analysis of impediments, which I've said time and again they should continue to do regardless of what this new affirmatively fair housing rule says. I think it becomes centerpiece to rectifying the situation and to actually go about doing that work intentionally. So thank you very much for this wealth of knowledge that you imparted and for having the wherewithal to have that book. I don't know where you got the inspiration, but I certainly appreciate it. I think it's tantamount to hopefully having a better future with regards to housing. And I was very interested in your comments regarding the tax credit programs. I do see where that has happened. I think more recently, in the last 20 years, I've seen more collaborations for making it available regardless of whether it's inner city or in the suburbs. I think that there's been some progression of that, not nearly enough, obviously, but I have seen where that I'm reminded of the LHOP LIFT program, which is in South Central PA, and they provide loans for those developments based on tax credits. And I think that's the direction that we should be headed in the future. But thank you so much for all your comments and for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Rothstein. And I just wanted to thank all of our panelists. And if you have any closing remarks, I welcome them right now. I do have a Ghanaian proverb, or well, I won't say proverb, but I'll say a metaphor that I wanted to close with. And it's about the concept of Sankofa. And Sankofa means to use the knowledge gained in the past to bring about positive change in the present and future. And I apply this to fair housing because, as Mr. Rothstein put in his book, we need to see exactly what really happened, and then we can admit it, acknowledge it, and remedy it to move forward. We can't have this idea that just isn't true. And so in order to create positive and equitable reconstruction for all, we need to look at our sins of the past and then move forward. But again, that's just my closing remark. Anybody else? Any of the other panelists? Okay.
Thank you, Vanessa. This is Tamika Hatcher. I just want to thank everyone for providing their mailing addresses, whether it was through the private chat or through my email address. I have put the address in there. It's Hatcher, so that looks like Thatcher, like Margaret, Thatcher@pa.gov. If you have not sent me your mailing address, please do so that we can get your books out to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstein.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstein. Great job.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage in this conversation with you. It was terrific.
We're fortunate to have you here and fortunate for your work.
Thank you. And Renessa, anybody who wants to be on the announcement list, or maybe it's Tamika, I should tell you this, anybody who wants to be on that announcement list, should they send it to you or to whom?
They can send their names and emails to me, and I can forward them to you, or I can forward them to Adrian Garcia, who can forward them to you. However, we do it. I have a few people who signed up already.
Okay, and make sure that they put the town in which they live, because we're organizing this on a local basis.
Yeah,
Okay.
I definitely look forward to being on
Thanks.
that list.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. And
Bye-bye.
Good evening, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tamika.
Yes, thanks so much, Tamika.
Vanessa,
No
great
problem. Thank you.
job. Great job.
Thank
I'll
you.
get this list. I've been writing fast and furiously, so I'll get you the list.
Thank you, guys. That was great. That was very good. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
thanks, Lyle. You did so well.
See, I cut it down. I was trying real hard. I was
Listen,
working
we
on it.
needed that. That's why I laughed, because finally we needed all of your
Right.
your votes.
This is a day when Lyle saved the day with his,
Yes.
longevity.
Mouth.
Lyle,
Don't let them do you like that, Lyle.
No.
I love y'all. That's why I'm laughing. You're right.
Thank you.
Wow, I like the beard. I
I'm
like the
digging the
beard
beard.
situation.
Digging the beard. Very nice.
I'm getting used to it. What I need to do is I'm afraid to go back to the guy who cuts my hair. So I stopped at Target, and I'm gonna get ready. If you ever saw the beginning of Full Metal Jacket, when all the recruits are sitting there, I'm getting ready to do that to me. So I'm playing with that. So we'll see.
Be careful. Be careful.
Chairman Bolstein, Joel, I think that I want to tell you, I don't know if you're taking the Benjamin Button vitamin or something, but I think you're aging backwards. Every time I see you, you're looking more and more like an undergrad every time.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm turning 60 next month, and I really am feeling my age lately. So
Wow.
Are you working from home or are you in the office every day?
I'm in the office every day
You're
now.
in the office.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
but there's
Is your
maybe-
office full?
No, maybe 10% of the people who normally come into work are here, and then everybody else is still working remotely. So
Gotcha.
it's strange. It's a strange feeling to come in and walk past so many empty offices, but we understand. And so if people don't feel comfortable coming into the office, we're not going to make people come in.
Yeah.
Sure.
Everybody's got reasons why, it's easier for them to work remotely. But listen, I just want to say thank you to everybody. Renessa, Tamika, everybody who put this together, Adrian, Lyle. I thought it was terrific. I really did.
Thank you.
I read the book cover to cover. It really had an impact on me. I guess the issue for us is, how do we fit into the solution to the problem?
Right.
If all we do is receive complaints from people who are saying they feel like they've been discriminated against and kind of put them into the process, that's going to help those individuals, but it's not going to help everybody else who isn't coming in and complaining. So
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is come up with a strategy on how we can make things better. A lot of that, I think, is going to be education and outreach.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know?
And
There's a
voting.
lot of
They
that.
got to vote. They got to get rid of those
Yeah.
people that aren't going to be attentive to the needs, and then still raise hell. And they'll be in good shape.
I mean,
Well,
look,
and-
I'll throw it out there, which is, I really think we need to open lines of communication with these local government agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And now in Pennsylvania, there's a couple of ways to do that. There's a conference, for example, every year on the State Association of Township Supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
We should have a panel at something like that.
Right.
Yep.
We should be participating in those things. There's a County Commissioners Association. Okay, they also meet annually. Okay, there's the Realtors Association. There's all these different places that come together, typically several times a year, that provide a really good opportunity for us to come in and deliver this message that they need to hear. Okay, because as the speaker, Mr. Rothstein said, just because these things happened 2 or 3 generations ago in terms of government doesn't mean that the people who are currently in government are absolved of any responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay? And we really need to, just like the people who are out there now creating these local advisory councils, these local commissions are doing so because they feel the need, like not enough is being done, and they want to take control over that. I think they'd want to take control over this as well, but they're going to need some guidance from us. What does it mean? How that they can do these things? Unfortunately, I think this is one of those situations where the problem is easier to identify than the solution. So I think it's up to all of us to kind of brainstorm through that. We have that new housing committee that was put together. And of course, everybody who I'm looking at now on the screen is deeply committed to helping bring about a solution. So I think, you guys need to be empowered to come up with some ideas and then bring it to the commission. And so that we can all work together to try and make things better, because there's a lot that needs to be fixed, really. So thank you to everyone.
I'm glad you said
Thank
that,
you.
Commissioner. One of the things that I've been working on is meeting with the Pennsylvania Housing Advocacy Group, as well as the Pennsylvania Real Estate Association, and had a conversation with also the DCED, talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing and how we can come together with local municipalities and have that discussion. And I believe that I also followed up on that very suggestion that you had regarding the Township Supervisors Organization. I did reach out to them, and I'm waiting for a response back so we can start moving in that area. And I agree that as a state agency, there's absolutely no reason why we cannot reach across the disciplines in our state to have this conversation across many of the commissions and entities that are part of the state, so that we can see some of that change happen. It'll be slow, but it's about time that we have that discussion. So I appreciate that support, and we'll probably call on you on more than one occasion to come in and pinch hit as well.
Thanks.
I would like to see us insert ourselves in the process so sometimes when you're buying landlord or secondary property or commercial property, you have to go through these classes. Why aren't we at the classes? I know that to be a landlord in Pennsylvania, you don't have to go through training, but why not? Why shouldn't there be certification to be a landlord, even if it's one building, a private building, and we have to be there to tell you what is fair housing and what's not? I mean,
that's one of the things that we discussed with the ECD as part of their whole affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is why you get that community the community development block grant. And so when I was having my discussion, I think it was she basically said to me, you know, when you had that discussion, I had an aha moment, and I'm like, yeah, why don't we do that? So hopefully it will be fruitful discussions going forward. But I certainly see that as a vital role for us at the PHRC to play, along with the enforcement, along with education and outreach, along with our policy initiatives. I think it all comes together for us to be able, and that we be not just at the table, but we be in the kitchen serving it up.
right.
Mhm. I agree. I agree. All right, well, I'm going to drop off. Appreciate
you, Chairman.
everybody and how hard everybody worked on this. And thanks.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Be safe.
Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording. Have a good afternoon.
All right, be safe.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.